Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive and for part 2 of the life and mysterious death of Dorothy Kilgallen. In part 1, we talked about who Dorothy was before she ever became connected to what happened to John F. Kennedy Jr. We followed her rise from a young newspaper reporter into one of the most famous journalists in America, a woman whose column was read by millions and whose access stretched from Broadway and Hollywood to politics, organized crime, and some of the most powerful people in the country. We also talked about Cuba before Castro, when Havana had become a playground for wealthy Americans and organized crime figures like Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano. And we looked at how the mafia built an empire there under the protection of Fulgencio Batista. We looked at how Fidel Castro's revolution destroyed that arrangement and why the mob, the CIA, and the United States government all developed their own reasons for wanting Castro gone. I have been so excited to get to part 2 because this is where all of those different worlds really begin colliding with each other, and there are a lot of worlds. We are going from Dorothy's personal life and her relationship with one of the biggest singers of the 1950s into the mob-controlled nightclubs of New York, J. Edgar Hoover's secrets, the Kennedy family's rise to power, the CIA's continued attempts to get rid of Fidel Castro, and the increasingly tangled relationship between the American government and organized crime. And then we get to Marilyn Monroe, because Marilyn's relationships with the Kennedy brothers, the surveillance inside her home, the questions surrounding the final hours of her life, and the efforts to control what the public was allowed to know about her death are not separate at all from Dorothy Kilgallen's story. Dorothy was watching all of this unfold in real time. She was watching Marilyn Monroe die, and then JFK die, and then Lee Harvey Oswald die. And she knew many of the people involved. She understood the connections, and she was already questioning official explanations long before President Kennedy was killed. There is so much information in this part, and some of it is genuinely unbelievable. Every time you think you figured out who was spying on who was working with who, or who was lying to who, another person enters the story and somehow makes it even more complicated. But all of these details matter because they help us understand what Dorothy already knew by November of 1963 and why, when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for killing President Kennedy and then silenced by Jack Ruby before he could ever speak for himself or stand trial, Dorothy was never going to simply accept the official story. So many people in America and the world never accepted that official story. So we have a lot to talk about today. Let's get into it. So by the time JFK was killed, Dorothy was not looking at the official story as a naive outsider. She was looking at it as a reporter who already understood the hidden machinery. Lee Harvey Oswald was presented as the lone gunman. Jack Ruby silenced Oswald before he could ever speak. The Warren Commission then told America the case was closed. Dorothy Kilgallen did not agree, so she started digging. She talked to sources, she followed the cracks, she interviewed Jack Ruby privately, the only journalist to do so, which is insane. She was the only reporter to get a one-on-one interview with Jack Ruby. She began building a file that, according to those close to her, she believed could blow the case wide open. And then on November 8th, 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse, and by then, the file was gone. In part 1, we followed Dorothy into the glitter, the Broadway columns, Hollywood, the celebrity feuds, the Cuban casinos, the mob money, the men in tuxedos, the government secrets hiding under the floorboards. Now we follow her into the darkness because Dorothy Kilgallen didn't just suspect that something was wrong with the official story of JFK's assassination. I think that she may have been getting close enough to prove it. So remember how in part 1, I discussed how Dorothy's husband, Richard Colmer, had become unfaithful to her pretty early on in their marriage, and how for a decade Dorothy had resisted returning the favor. Now, that was true. She stayed faithful and didn't have, side relationships until someone came on Dorothy's radar who became irresistible to her. His name was Johnny Ray, a singer who exploded into fame in 1951 and became one of the first pop stars who seemed to make audiences lose their minds emotionally, crying, screaming, collapsing, the whole pre-Elvis hysteria package. And Johnny Ray achieved this effect by really standing out amongst his peers at the time. He performed like he was emotionally falling apart in real time, and audiences in the early 1950s, they weren't used to that kind of public display of emotion from male singers. Or men in general, let's be honest. So Johnny Ray would cry, shake, clutch the microphone. He would clearly be very into the music, and he would show not only that he was feeling something, but that his music was coming from a real place. It was authentic. He didn't sound manufactured or polished. He sounded exposed and real. And Johnny Ray actually attributed this to having become partially deaf when he was only 13. He said, quote, "My need for sincerity traces back to when I was a child and lost my hearing. I became withdrawn. I had an emotional need to develop a relationship with other people," end quote. So in 1952, part of Dorothy Kilgallen's job involved covering young nightclub singers and entertainment figures in New York, and several sources trace the beginning of her friendship to Johnny Ray to 1952 during his sudden rise to international fame. In January of 1952, Dorothy wrote about Johnny Ray in her column, talking about the release of one of his hit records, Please Mr. Sun. She really liked it. In April of 1952, Dorothy's husband, Richard, made a disparaging comment about Johnny Ray during their morning show, Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick, and apparently this caused an argument that unfolded in real time as they were on the air, and according to the Saturday Evening Post, the argument, quote, almost came to throwing crockery, end quote, which basically means like they were about to throw their coffee mugs at each other. They were very upset, like everyone listening felt like something was going on. Now, that same month, Dorothy went to the Copacabana to see Johnny Ray perform live, and when he finished his set, she stood along with everyone else in the club to give him a standing ovation. He was a big hit. Everyone loved him. Actually, his career was kind of short-lived after this. Dorothy and Johnny Ray would become friends. They would eventually have an intimate relationship. According to Johnny Ray, he was the first man to ever make Dorothy feel something in the bedroom, if you know what I mean. Like she'd been with other men in the bedroom before, but when she was with him, that's the first time that it actually came to like a culmination, if you know what I mean. Okay, so let's talk about the Copacabana, or the Copa. Opened in New York City in 1940 at 10 East 60th Street. Now, publicly, it was one of the hottest nightclubs in America. I mean, they wrote songs about it, and the most coveted performers of the day would be invited to take the stage there. Now, the public face of the club was a guy named Monty Proser. He's a well-known nightclub man, press agent to the stars, but behind Proser, the Copa was widely known to be mob-connected, mob-run. So Proser had gone to Frank Costello, one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York, for funding, and Costello had installed one of his associates, Jules Podell, inside the club to watch the finances, and by the late 1940s, Monty Proser had been effectively pushed out, and Jules Podell was in total control, which meant the mob was basically in total control. Not only was it well known that the mob was running the Copa, it actually seemed to make the nightclub more popular and profitable because it was seen at the time as a guarantee of a good night out. So the Genovese crime family, which had previously been run by Lucky Luciano, and by the time the Copa came around was led by Frank Costello, they ran a tight ship, making sure that the local riffraff, like pickpockets and lower-level street criminals, didn't dare pull their stunts at the Copa. The mob also demanded perfection at their establishments. They provided the most excellent food, the strongest drinks, the best entertainment, and a legendary five-star service every time. Everyone wanted to be at the Copa, and in one of the weirdest fun facts of history, that everyone included longtime FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who we're going to talk about today because this guy, diabolical. And now it's weird because J. Edgar Hoover presented as this straight-laced, morally clean, tough-on-crime type of person. So to see him going to nightclubs, much less known mob-connected nightclubs, would have been just so out of character. But here's the thing about J. Edgar Hoover. He was a man of many facets, many complications and contradictions. First of all, for the longest time, like the longest, Hoover pretended the mafia didn't even exist, even though it was an extremely obvious fact to everyone else that they did. He just basically pretended as if there was no national mafia syndicate. He downplayed that entire obvious fact for years, and he was only forced to begrudgingly acknowledge that the mob was a thing in 1957 when state police in Appalachian, New York raided a mob summit and found major mob figures from around the country gathered at the home of Joseph Barbera. So basically, they're like, oh, well, yeah, all of these mob figures from around the country are gathering at the home of one other criminal underworld figure, and they're having meetings, and we know that they do this stuff all the time. So yeah, it's kind of like a public thing now. And even at that point, J. Edgar Hoover still kind of protected the mafia. And he did this basically because it didn't fit his agenda and because he was an enormous hypocrite. So while he crafted this public image for himself and for the FBI as strict, morally pure, law-abiding protectors of America, J. Edgar Hoover's secret lifestyle created severe vulnerabilities that historians believe compromised national law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover loved to drink and he loved to gamble. He was an obsessed horse racing bettor, known to frequently visit tracks like Del Mar in California and Hialeah Park in Florida. And of course, he would be seen at these places and called out on it. People would be like, hey, Hoover, what are you doing? Like doing illegal gambling at horse races, what's up with this? I thought you were on the up and up. I thought you were straight-laced. So J. Edgar Hoover told the public and the press, like, no, it's not like that. This is just a gentleman's pastime. I only ever place the minimum legal $2 wagers, which, as it turns out, surprise, surprise, complete lie. Former Assistant FBI Director William Sullivan later revealed that Hoover had used FBI agents to covertly place bets worth hundreds of dollars on his behalf, and he won. Now, why did he win? Because he was getting insider tips from the mafia who ran the horse races and ran the tracks. Just like they got their hands in everything. If there's money happening, if there's gambling happening at this time in America, better believe the mafia had their fingerprints on it. So mob bosses like Frank Costello quickly figured out that they couldn't buy J. Edgar Hoover. They couldn't buy the FBI director with the standard envelopes of cash that they used with other law enforcement figures and politicians. So instead, they fed him insider tips on fixed horse races through mutual friends like gossip columnist Walter Winchell. So Hoover was always at these nightclubs and racetracks that are owned and run by the mob, basically. And he's always there with his longtime deputy director, Clyde Tolson, who, now this hasn't been proven, but strongly believed that J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson had a romantic and sexual relationship for over 40 years. Okay, so not only did Hoover and Tolson drive to and from work together every single day, they ate lunch and dinner together every day as well. They spent every weekend together, every Christmas together, summer vacations together. So when Hoover died in 1972, he actually bypassed his own family and he left the bulk of his massive estate to Tolson. And Tolson was the one who accepted the American flag draped over J. Edgar Hoover's coffin at his state funeral, which is, as you know, a gesture traditionally given to the surviving spouse. Now, obviously, I don't care if J. Edgar Hoover was gay. Do you? And it does seem that 40 years is a long time to be with someone every day if you don't actually love them. So, I'm sure that Hoover and Tolson had this, very intimate, close relationship, a love story for the ages. I don't care that you're gay, but J. Edgar Hoover was such a dickhead hypocrite that it almost feels wrong that he should have had the opportunity to have such a loving and intimate relationship while he was publicly denouncing other members of the LGBTQ community and making it impossible for them to have the same, right? So if you were gay back then, Hoover would not like you. Publicly, he would talk a lot of shit about you. Hoover publicly claimed that gay individuals possessed a character flaw that made them uniquely vulnerable to being blackmailed by communists and foreign enemies. He also supported Eisenhower's executive order banning gay people from government work because, according to him, these quote-unquote sex perverts in government positions could be easily manipulated into revealing top-secret information to protect their secret lifestyles. I don't disagree that people who work in government and politics and stuff, their sexual proclivities, whether it's gay, straight, or anything, will sometimes make them more apt to be blackmailed, or they can be, like honeypotted more easily. But it's not obviously just gay men. It's plenty of straight men too. Just take a look through the Epstein files. And how ironic then that Hoover would say all this, because when he traveled with his deputy director, Tolson, they would stay for free in luxury hotels owned by the mob. They would eat and drink for free at clubs and restaurants connected to the mob, because the mob possessed intimate knowledge and documented evidence of J. Edgar Hoover's illegal gambling, heavy drinking, and possible closeted sexuality. So because J. Edgar Hoover's in the FBI and he's federal government, and the mob is a national crime syndicate, there was a sort of silent truce born, silent to America, well known to the mob and J. Edgar Hoover. But the mob kept Hoover's secrets safe, and in turn, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI pretended the mob didn't exist, right? They kept the mob safe by publicly maintaining for decades that there was no mafia and not using any federal law enforcement resources to investigate the mafia. And this is the same man, J. Edgar Hoover, who said, quote, "When morals decline and good men do nothing, evil flourishes," end quote. He also said, quote, "The thousands of criminals I have seen in 40 years of law enforcement have had one thing in common. Every single one was a liar," end quote. And it certainly takes one to know one. J. Edgar Hoover was the epitome of projection, and I heavily dislike him for multiple reasons. So in 1957, after the whole Appalachian thing, where everyone was gathered at one mob boss's house in upstate New York, Hoover was like, "Oh, hey, now that I have undeniable proof that's actually been published to the public, I will say maybe the mob exists." Okay. But he still really didn't devote any FBI resources to investigating the mob, and he continued benefiting from organized crime. And this is important because when a new young president took over in 1960, J. Edgar Hoover's entire house of cards would be challenged, and I truly believe it was part of what set into place a series of events that led to the assassination of JFK and a bunch of other things that happened after. So we do have to talk about how JFK got to the White House. And in order to talk about that, we need to quickly look at his family and specifically his father, because JFK certainly didn't become president by chance, okay? It's one of those, it's always summertime for you and the living is always easy, daddy's rich and your mama's good looking kind of things. And if you know, you know. So John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or Jack as his friends and family would call him, was born on May 29th, 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second of the 9 children of Rose and Joseph Kennedy. Now, by the time his son became president, Joseph Kennedy would have accumulated a net worth of somewhere around $500 million. That would be approximately $4.5 billion today. And you know what I always say? Net worth means network. I don't always say that. I actually just said that for the first time today, but I can't think of an instance where it is more true than with Joseph Kennedy, because you have to wonder, how the hell did that man make so much money? How was he so lucky to be incredibly successful in every single business venture that he tried his hand at? Well, because he wasn't lucky, he knew the right people. Net worth is network. After graduating from Harvard, Joseph Kennedy became Columbia Trust Company's president, making him the youngest bank president in America, basically right out of college. During World War I, he was the assistant general manager of a massive Bethlehem steel shipyard in Massachusetts, and that's where he met and befriended a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who at that time was the assistant secretary of the Navy. Then in the 1920s, Joseph Kennedy was an incredibly successful stock and commodity broker who was known to use aggressive insider trading and stock manipulation tactics that, by the way, were entirely legal at that time. There's an ironic twist to this, but I mean, he and his rich friends did some genuinely disgusting things and really screwed over a lot of people who couldn't afford to be screwed over, but we don't have time to get into that here. We could make an entire series about Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy also happened to somehow know that the economic bubble was about to burst, and he pulled his entire fortune out of the stock market just before the Wall Street crash of 1929. He aggressively and callously shorted the market, meaning he placed bets that stocks would fall because he knew they were going to fall because of insider trading, and then he made millions while the rest of the country fell into the Great Depression. How did he anticipate that the stock market was going to crash? Did the man have a crystal ball or a mystical ability to see into the future? Now, according to Joe Kennedy, he was just really smart. He was the sharpest of businessmen. He took chances, and he told a story that took place in the winter of 1928, just months before the stock market crash in October of 1929. He said he had stepped out of his Wall Street office to get a quick shoe shine when the young boy buffing his shoes started giving him tips on what stocks to buy. And this interaction allegedly triggered an epiphany for Joseph Kennedy. He realized that if the uneducated, broke young boy who was shining his shoes had a stock portfolio, if the ignorant masses were in the stock market, then the bubble had reached its peak and it was time to get out of the market. Now, this story is bullshit, in my opinion, allegedly. Don't come for me, Kennedys. Joseph Kennedy didn't need to rely on street corner, normal people gossip. He didn't have to have the sharpest of intuition. He was deeply embedded with the most powerful financiers and corporate executives of the 1920s. The wholesaler insider network, which included Joe and his tightly knit circle of mega wealthy bankers, politicians, and company owners. And these people knew things months before the regular public even got a hint of it, sometimes years before. And they shared their secrets with each other over steak dinners and told their friends to get out before shit went down. They shared secrets and they actively teamed up to trick regular people, buying useless stock, passing it back and forth to make it look like it was valuable and that it was rising. And they would pay off newspaper writers to print fake stories about how good this stock was so that regular people would be like, oh, this stock's good. The newspaper says it is. Joe Kennedy's invested in it. And these regular people would sink their life savings into the stock market, hoping to have, just a little bit for retirement. And then once the price of the stock was high, Joe and his buddies would secretly sell everything at a massive profit and leave everyone else holding the worthless stock. They used other people, average people's money, to make the stock worth something. And then because they knew it wasn't worth anything, they stole the money. They stole the money. So Joe Kennedy knew the stock market was going to crash because he was told. And then he and his friends all pulled out. They kept their money. And then they also bet against stocks that they knew were going to fall. So then they made money. It's just absolutely disgusting. Now, Joe Kennedy was also close friends with the highest ranking politicians in Washington, including the people who ran the nation's biggest banks. It's widely agreed that Joe's shoe shine story is just a cover so that he didn't look like the evil villain crook that he actually was, allegedly. But wait, there's more. In 1926, Joseph Kennedy bought several Hollywood studios that were struggling. He stripped down their operating costs and forced mergers to create RKO Pictures that made him several $1 million so that he could heavily fund FDR's presidential campaign in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Remember, the guy he's already friends with. And basically, yeah, Joe Kennedy bought himself a president. And then in 1933, Joseph Kennedy once again must have been looking into his crystal ball, and he was able to see the future because magically and without any help or information that Prohibition was about to end, Joe Kennedy knew that it was. And in the fall of 1933, months before the law changed, Kennedy traveled to England and secured the exclusive American distribution rights for high-end British liquor brands like Dewar's and Gordon's. And he then created Somerset Importers so that when Prohibition ended, well, Joseph Kennedy was ready with warehouses full of legal, delicious liquor ready to go way before anyone else even could catch up. He was like 10, 20 steps ahead. Now, Somerset Importers became a legal liquor empire that would generate massive wealth for the Kennedy family for decades. There is that sharp business savvy again, right? Joseph Kennedy he knows stuff because he's intelligent and he listens to his gut, except that's not what it was. It was a government-backed monopoly. Now, remember that FDR was the one who ended Prohibition. And you could say like, oh, that's just a coincidence, just because FDR was the president and Joe Kennedy basically got him elected and they were friends. That doesn't mean that FDR would tell Joe Kennedy that Prohibition was going to end so that Kennedy could get ready for it. But you would be wrong because Joe Kennedy actually went to England to talk to all of these high-end liquor brands with FDR's son, James, right? He knew Prohibition was going to end because FDR told him. And FDR also told him, bring my son with you so that they know you're legit over there. You have the president's son with you, which basically means you have the backing of the American government. Now, Joe Kennedy was one of FDR's biggest financial backers that helped him win the presidency in 1932. Joe Kennedy also traveled around and convinced other millionaires and billionaires to give money to FDR. And in American politics, the unspoken rule is that presidents pay back their biggest donors with exclusive business opportunities and insider tips to help them become financially wealthy. So it's like, yeah, give me like $5 million, help me become president. I'm not going to pay you $5 million back. I'm going to give you opportunities and information that's going to pay you back $5 million 20 times over, right? FDR would also appoint Joe Kennedy as the very first chairman of the SEC, which is hilarious considering what Kennedy did to the stock market. And basically people like him were the reason that the SEC even needed to exist. It was to, make sure that there wasn't fraud happening in like securities and trading and stuff. And when FDR got pushback, they were like, why are you making a crook the head of the SEC? And he was like, listen, because he knows how to completely scam the system. Like he knows better than anyone what kind of scams and what kind of tricks and what kind of like insider trading and stuff can be happening. So of course he's the best man for the job because he wrote the book on how to screw over and scam the system. Oh, funny. FDR also made Joe Kennedy the ambassador to Great Britain. And in 1945, Joe Kennedy got into real estate. He went on to establish a massive empire that included multiple high-end estates across the U.S. that would give his large and growing family the ultimate playground for power and networking so that they too could turn their network into net worth. Now, summers for the Kennedy family would be spent in a sweeping mansion with views of the Atlantic in Cape Cod. This is known as Hyannis Port, a very famous Kennedy property. Winters were spent at their Palm Beach estate. There was a 20-room mansion in Westchester, New York, to show high society that the Kennedys have arrived. And this is how a young Jack Kennedy grew up, surrounded by wealth and privilege, boarding schools in Connecticut, college at Harvard, of course, and a political career that was already mapped out for him before he even knew who he was. Now, it was actually JFK's older brother, Joseph Jr., who was supposed to have become president. I will say that Rose and Joe Kennedy weren't like super big fans of their son, Jack. John F. Kennedy, who I'm talking about, JFK, they were not huge fans of him. He was kind of sickly. He wasn't like all that intelligent. He kind of didn't seem to have much of an attention span, and they didn't have high hopes. But Joe was the one who was going to be, the one going out there and making a name for the Kennedy family in the political stage. But then when both JFK and his brother Joseph Jr. were overseas during World War II, JFK came back a war hero, and Joseph Jr. sadly died. I believe he was a pilot, and he died in his plane. So the elder Joseph, JFK's father, he pivoted and then focused his energy on JFK. Basically, Joe Jr. had been the heir. JFK was the spare. Now, JFK would announce his presidency on January 2nd, 1960, and Dorothy Kilgallen was pleased because she really liked him. He was the first Catholic president. Dorothy was raised very Catholic. She liked what he stood for. She liked that he was young and seemed kind of like fresh and willing to do things differently than they had been done before. JFK also made a decision that was fueled by his father's advice. At that point, when he became president, he made his younger brother, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General. Robert Kennedy, aka RFK, and almost immediately, RFK and J. Edgar Hoover became like complete bitter rivals, and their relationship would become one of the most intense power struggles in the history of American government. So when RFK took over the Justice Department, this made him J. Edgar Hoover's direct boss. And RFK had been taking inventory, looking at the numbers, and he was like, something's going on here. I am appalled to find out that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI are still devoting massive resources to chasing communists all over town, and they are putting almost nothing towards investigating and stopping organized crime. So at that time, when RFK looked at the books, over 400 agents in the New York field office alone were assigned to full-time surveillance of domestic communists, right? So this is where the Hollywood blacklist comes in, and how basically everybody in America at that time was suspected of being a communist. Like, you weren't breathing air if you weren't suspected of being a communist. But RFK thought this was not necessary. He believed that communism was a fading political movement in the United States. He didn't feel that the average citizen who was a communist was really doing all that much damage. So 4 agents in that same office, the New York field office, they were assigned to track organized crime. So we've got a huge disparity. We got hundreds of agents running around finding domestic communists, and then we've got 4 who are maybe looking at organized crime, or just on the books they were, when really they also were chasing communists. And on a national level, like outside of New York, the FBI's organized crime section consisted of fewer than 20 agents, like in all of the United States. So RFK and Hoover, they did not agree. They went back and forth in public. They threw shots at each other. RFK said that communism, quote, couldn't be more feeble and less of a threat, end quote. And Hoover bit back. Hoover was like, well, Martin Luther King Jr. is a communist working with the Kremlin, and isn't it strange that both RFK and his brother, the President JFK, had met with Martin Luther King Jr., which meant maybe they could be under the influence of communism as well. So, that was Hoover's thing. Like, anytime somebody spoke out against him, he was like, you're a communist. So this was a public feud. And so RFK was basically like, I don't care what you think. It's weird that you aren't directly interested in organized crime when it's destroying this country. Do what I tell you to do. I'm your boss. Now, at the same time, the Kennedy administration was kind of sick of Hoover. They were actively laying the groundwork to replace Hoover as director of the FBI. In those days, 70 was the age that was mandatory for retirement from federal civil service. So if you worked for the government, the federal government, like, you would have to retire by the time you were 70. And in 1960, J. Edgar Hoover was 65. So the Kennedys were like, well, he's not 70 yet, but he sucks and we hate him. And so we want to figure out a way to get J. Edgar Hoover out before the mandatory retirement age. Like, is there a way we can do that? we are the president. Like JFK's like, I'm the president. I can change the law or something, right? Can't I? And so they're trying to figure out how to get Hoover out. They wanted someone younger in the job who would actively address the issues they felt were important to the country, like organized crime. Now, of course, J. Edgar Hoover was well aware that these conversations were happening. He's the head of the FBI. They're wiretapping people illegally all the time. Like he knew that the Kennedys hated him and they wanted to get him out. And he was like, no, this job is all I have. Literally, it is my identity. And without it, who's going to tell me what horse races to bet on? So he knew that he needed to do something. He had to get something on the Kennedys to get them off of his back, to get them to back off. Now, luckily for him, he got exactly what he needed in early 1961. So in the late summer of 1960, there was a popular singer named Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire sisters. She was having an affair with Sam Giancana, the mob boss of Chicago. At that exact same time, as we know, Giancana was recruited by the CIA to help with the plot to kill Fidel Castro in Cuba. So Giancana had to leave Chicago and he had to start traveling to Miami a lot to plan this. And while he was in Miami in the summer of 1960, he became extremely suspicious and paranoid that his girlfriend Phyllis, who at that time was performing in Las Vegas, so she was basically living there long term or short term, so for only a few months, but she was staying there. She wasn't traveling back and forth. So he was concerned that Phyllis in Las Vegas was cheating on him with a comedian named Dan Rowan, which, like, as it turns out, she was. But so Giancana became so fueled by jealousy and so erratic that he contacted the CIA. And he was like, my girlfriend's cheating on me. I need to go handle this. And I'm going to abandon the whole Castro plot so I can fly to Vegas and catch Phyllis in the act. So Giancana's contact person at the CIA was a man named Robert Mayhew, who had been an FBI agent during the 40s and then who opened a PI firm in 1954 after he retired. He was also a CIA cutout. And if you've been watching our Epstein series, you will recognize that term, a CIA cutout. So whether it's a business or a convention or a person, a cutout means that this person, convention, business, whatever, is acting as a buffer. So they are working on behalf of the CIA, but they are not the CIA. So it's going to give the CIA distance and deniability if anybody ever finds out what's going on. So Giancana went to Robert Mayhew and he's like, I'm going to leave. I'm done. I don't care about Castro. My girlfriend's cheating on me. And Robert Mayhew told Giancana, like, calm down, stick to the plan, do what you're here to do. I will handle this. Like, I will figure out what's going on. And then Mayhew hired another former FBI agent turned PI to go to Vegas, break into the comedian Dan Rowan's hotel room and put an illegal wiretap on Rowan's phone so that they could spy on him and see if he was having an affair with Phyllis. But this guy, this PI, I don't know if this was intentional or just dumb, but it was dumb. He left his monitoring equipment, so the equipment that he would listen to the wiretap like details through, like you can hear the phone calls through the equipment. It's like a machine and then big headphones. This was the 1960s. He left all of that equipment unattended in another hotel room. And then the maid came in the morning to like clean and make the bed. And the maid stumbled upon this stuff. She was like, what the hell is this? I know what this is. I've seen movies, somebody spying on someone. And then she called the police and then this guy got arrested. And he was questioned by local law enforcement. Now, at that point, the FBI began investigating this because the FBI wants to know, is this something like, benign, or is this an issue of national security? Like, are these communists? Are these actual spies from Russia or Cuba or whatever coming over here and spying on a singer and her comedian lover? I don't know why the FBI got involved. I have my suspicions. So basically the FBI gets involved. They're questioning people, but no one would really talk or say anything concrete until finally Robert Mayhew gave them a name, the name of Colonel Sheffield Edwards, Director of Security for the CIA. And Robert Mayhew said he was finally able to talk about it, and he was finally able to answer the FBI's question because the Bay of Pigs had happened. So once again, this happens in the summer of 1960. The wiretap is found out. The FBI gets involved. They questioned Robert Mayhew. They questioned the PI who put the wiretap on. They questioned the comedian, Dan Rowan. And he was like, yeah, the mob's definitely involved. When he first talked to them, he was like, the mob's definitely involved because they called me and they told me, like, shut up and I better not press charges. So Dan Rowan actually did not press charges. So there was no local kind of legal action happening, but the FBI was looking into the illegal wiretap because that's what they do, even though they also used illegal wiretaps, but whatever. So they're looking into that. And then by the time basically the spring of 1961 rolls around and the Bay of Pigs happens, that's when Robert Mayhew is like, okay, I can tell you now, like, the national security issues are over. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place from April 17th to April 20th of 1961. And during those 4 days, a CIA-sponsored paramilitary group of Cuban exiles landed on the beaches of Cuba in a failed attempt to overthrow the communist government of Fidel Castro. So we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it looked like it was Cubans rising up, and it was, but also they were CIA-trained Cubans who were basically helped by the American government. So Robert Mayhew was like, now that it happened and it failed, I can tell you that the reason we tapped that comedian's phone was because Sam Giancana was working with the CIA in a plot to kill Castro, and he was worried that his girlfriend was cheating on him, and that was the extent of the operation. There were no national security interests. It was just relationship stuff, and we needed him calm so he would stay on task, and I couldn't tell you, the FBI, because the CIA wanted this whole working with organized crime thing and this whole plot to kill Castro thing. They wanted that kept quiet. They didn't want you to know. And at that point, the CIA was forced to admit to the FBI that they had been working with organized crime figures and brief the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover about that plan, as well as beg them to drop the federal wiretapping case, which would implicate several mob figures that they had been working with. So through the wiretapping case, J. Edgar Hoover learned that Sam Giancana wasn't just, getting in bed with Phyllis. He also had another mistress, and he shared that mistress with JFK. And we talked about her already. Her name was Judith Campbell Exner. She had visited the White House more than 20 times during her relationship with the president that lasted about 2 years and had started before he even became president. She was always calling the White House, like, 2 years they were together, okay? So now J. Edgar Hoover, he knows through the wiretap, because they found the wiretap equipment, which means the tapes and everything are on there, so they got transcripts of the phone calls, and they learn that, this woman, Judith, exists. She's sleeping with Sam Giancana. She's been sleeping with the president for 2 years. And that's exactly what he needed, because remember, JFK, family man, beautiful wife, he's starting a family, he's a young president, he was the hope of the future, and it would not look good if he was cheating on his wife with anyone, much less a woman who was connected to organized crime, while his brother RFK was over in the Justice Department, like, organized crime is bad, down with it, it just wouldn't look good. So on March 22nd, 1961, J. Edgar Hoover went straight to the White House and had a private lunch with JFK. No one knows what was said, but right before he did that, he dropped a memo directly on the desk of RFK. So basically, it's probable that both conversations went about the same. The president is sharing a bed with a woman who has unrestricted access to the head of the Chicago mob, meaning she could have planted listening devices in the Oval Office, she could have stolen classified documents, she could use the relationship that she has with the president to blackmail the president. Not only that, but JFK is sleeping with the girlfriend of a man Robert Kennedy claims your administration is actively going after, the very same people RFK says he wants to see behind bars. And the CIA is working with these mafia guys to take out Castro. And it doesn't take much to assume that the President of the United States and his brother, the head of the Justice Department, probably know about these plots. So, is the Kennedy administration a big-ass hypocrite like me, J. Edgar Hoover? Are you telling the American people that you want to protect them from the mafia while also working with the mafia and protecting the mafia exactly like I'm doing? Me, J. Edgar Hoover? Okay, so one of the many questions is, did JFK and RFK know about the CIA's plot to kill Castro? They obviously knew about the Bay of Pigs, which was overthrowing Castro. They obviously were trying to see Castro removed from power in Cuba for the reasons we already discussed. Last time I talked about how the initial push to kill Castro had started in 1960 during the final year of the Eisenhower administration. And then it failed, and they weren't able to achieve their mission. But now we're hearing that the plots continued on after JFK became president. So did they know? Did the Kennedys know that the CIA was working with the mob? And that uncertainty is part of what makes this whole period so dangerous, right? Different parts of the government were moving through the same shadows. The White House, the CIA, the mafia, Cuban exiles, random retired FBI agents who are now CIA cutouts, all of this weird stuff. And not everyone could later prove exactly who knew what, when they knew it, or how much they were willing not to know. But it would be kind of messed up for RFK to be so verbally against the mafia while knowing that the CIA was actively working with them, right? So as far as I can tell, and this took a while to piece together. So here's the timeline. And it's full of deceit and cover-ups, but here's the timeline as best as I can put it together. In 1960, during the Eisenhower administration, Sheffield Edwards, who was the director of security for the CIA, he contacted Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. Roselli was also high-ranking in the Chicago mob outfit, and he was organized crime's primary liaison to Vegas and Hollywood. So the plot to kill Castro was agreed upon between the CIA and these mob figures, and then set into action. But then reportedly, sometime in late 1961, that plan was aborted. Now, according to Lawrence Houston, who was the lawyer of the CIA for almost 30 years, he said he didn't know why the plan was put to bed, why it was ended. And that's because it never was. And in my opinion, Lawrence Houston knew that very well. According to church committee testimony, and remember, the church committee was the ones who were tasked into looking into abuses of power by the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, etc. So according to church committee testimony, in November of 1961, the CIA Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Bissell, took the Castro plot away from Sheffield Edwards in the Office of Security and handed it to a man named William Harvey under a highly classified project called ZR/Rifle. So Harvey testified that Bissell told him to create what he called an executive action capability, which Harvey said was a euphemism for execution. And Harvey also said that he had been told by the White House to get this going. So Harvey's saying it's coming straight from the top. In April of 1962, Harvey needed to take over the existing mob connections and assets that had been going during the phase one of the Kill Castro plot. So he approached Sheffield Edwards to ask for an introduction to Johnny Roselli. And Edwards was like, yeah, no problem. Here you go. And on April 8th, Harvey met with Roselli in New York, and later that same month, he met with him in Miami, where he personally handed the mobster a fresh batch of poison pills intended for Castro. This is a high-ranking CIA member. Now, Harvey testified that he briefed his direct supervisor, Deputy Director Richard Helms, on the operation. And together, he and Helms decided it was best to keep it a secret from John McCone, the new CIA director. So the CIA is keeping secrets from not only other people in the CIA, but like the head of the CIA. Well, why did they want to keep it a secret from McCone? Because John McCone was appointed the director of the CIA by John F. Kennedy Jr., the new president. So there is some evidence at that point that maybe the CIA was trying to keep it a secret from the Kennedy administration altogether, which means that at least JFK wouldn't have known about it if they were trying to keep it a secret from him. But also, were they trying to keep it a secret from RFK, who was notoriously against organized crime? And it wasn't so much the plot to kill Castro. Like, I don't know if they were trying to make sure the president and his brother didn't know that they were trying to kill Fidel Castro. I think that they didn't want them to know that they were using mafia figures to do it. So in the spring of 1962, Sheffield Edwards, who, remember, was in charge of phase 1 of the Kill Castro plan, and Lawrence Houston, the lawyer of the CIA, they go and meet with RFK. And at that point, they briefed him about the Castro plan with the mob. And I think that they really only briefed him about this because by that time, Robert Mayhew had admitted about the CIA working with the mob to, kill Castro to the FBI. So now they're like, oh, well, we have to kind of admit to this and we have to tell RFK, who's the head of the Justice Department. And reportedly, RFK was furious. They said he seemed to be hearing about it for the first time, and he ordered the CIA to break contact with the mafia group and not work with organized crime at all anymore. He said he was concerned that any government dealings with the mob might compromise future prosecutions against them, which it would. Now, they said he seemed fine with the killing of Castro, though. He just didn't want to use the mob to do it, and this is according to Sheffield Edwards and Lawrence Houston, the lawyer. So Lawrence Houston would later claim that they had talked to RFK before William Harvey reinvigorated the Castro plan with the mob, phase 2 of Kill Castro. And Sheffield Edwards would claim that when Harvey had approached him, asking him for a connection to Johnny Roselli, he said no, because they had already talked to RFK, and RFK was mad, and he told them no more working with the mob. Neither of those statements were true because Sheffield Edwards and Lawrence Houston briefed RFK about the CIA working with the mob after William Harvey had already connected with Johnny Roselli. And Johnny Roselli also testified that William Harvey became his primary case officer in 1962, supplying him with cash and poison pills. And he, Johnny Roselli, continued trying to get those pills into Cuba well into late 1962. And he was completely unaware that RFK had ordered the operation to end. Then, in 1975, Major General Edward Lansdale, which, if you know anything about MKUltra and weird government psyops, that name will ring a bell to you. Major General Edward Lansdale. He told the Washington Star that RFK told him in 1962 to prepare contingency plans to get rid of Castro. And then Lansdale passed that order on to Harvey. The next day, like after Lansdale said this to the media, he came back to the media and he was like, no, I didn't say that. I didn't mean it, at least. He now said that RFK never told him to kill anyone, and he said, quote, assassination is not my bag, end quote. He also said he could not recall if he had ever dealt with Harvey, the guy at the CIA who was heading the phase 2 of the Kill Castro plan, when in fact, Lansdale, right? Major General Lansdale was the chief of the Pentagon's task force for Operation Mongoose, which was the operation to get rid of Castro. He was basically running point on the Bay of Pigs, and assassination was exactly his bag. It was like his main bag, okay? Like I said, this guy's a very interesting person. He was involved in all sorts of out-of-the-country attempts to destabilize foreign governments. So leaks from the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee, because they were looking into all of this stuff, that had prompted him to make those statements in 1975. So he initially admitted to journalists that he was ordered by RFK to get rid of Castro by any means necessary, and he acknowledged that, in his opinion, he felt this phrasing could include assassination. But then realizing he had just tied the Kennedy brothers to a potential murder plot of a foreign leader, he issued a clarification that he had not been ordered to take direct action of any sort, and he didn't even know if he had ever directly dealt with William Harvey, who was running the Kill Castro plan. Now, here's what I think. I think that RFK did probably say something along the lines of, yeah, let's get rid of Castro by any means necessary, hoping that somebody under him would pick up on it, that he meant any means necessary, like, yeah, try to destabilize the government, try to overthrow him. But like, if that doesn't work, it's okay if he dies, right? I think that's what, but I do think RFK was like very against using the mafia to do that. Then the Church Committee found a memo that Major General Lansdale had issued after an August 10th, 1962 secret meeting between RFK, CIA Director John McCone, and several other high-level figures. And allegedly during that meeting, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara explicitly raised the subject of killing Castro. And then after the meeting, Lansdale issued a memo, because Lansdale was at the meeting, and he ordered intelligence officers to develop contingency plans for the liquidation of leaders of Cuba's regime. So this meeting happens. The idea of killing Castro is brought up. Apparently the people in the room, maybe some of them agreed or some of them disagreed about it, but at the end of the day, what Major General Lansdale got from it is like, yeah, it's time to liquidate the leaders of Cuba's regime, which obviously includes Fidel Castro. Now, when William Harvey saw the memo, he was incensed. He was pissed. He panicked. He called General Lansdale's aide, and he was like, "What's wrong with you? Can you please remove the assassination language from that memo?" He said it was, quote, "the inadmissibility and stupidity of putting this type of comment in writing in such a document," end quote. So we know that Harvey was running such an operation, right? He wasn't like, "How dare you order people to kill Fidel Castro?" No, he wasn't worried about that. He just didn't want the words to appear on paper because he didn't want what he was doing to bring attention or an investigation. And he wanted to keep certain people like CIA Director John McCone out of the loop. But here's the thing, like, he also wanted it expunged from history. He didn't want people to look back later and see a memo like that and be like, what, the CIA was totally okay with killing a foreign leader? He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He didn't want his name to eventually be like wrapped into that. But here you are, Harvey, wrapped into it. So did RFK know that the CIA was working with the mob to take down Castro? Yes, at some point, and allegedly he ordered them to stop. Did he know that the CIA was trying to kill Castro? Yes, I believe he did. So what happened after J. Edgar Hoover placed that memo on RFK's desk and had lunch with JFK? Well, that was the exact moment that the Kennedys went from being J. Edgar Hoover's boss to being his hostage. The relationship with Judith Campbell Exner was immediately ended, and any internal White House conversations about getting Hoover out before retirement completely ceased. And Hoover remained the director of the FBI for the remainder of his life. J. Edgar Hoover basically said, "If you don't leave me alone and let me continue what I'm doing, everyone will know the president is cheating on his beloved wife with multiple women, and everyone will know that his brother is a hypocrite and a warmonger and is willing to work with the very people he claims he hates in order to kill foreign leaders," which neither JFK or RFK wanted that, right? They don't want the truth to come out. So we know that the mob has made claims that they were responsible for what happened to JFK, him being killed, because the Kennedys had double-crossed them. One of the most infamous alleged statements came from Santo Traficante Jr., who, according to his lawyer, Frank Regano, said near the end of his life, quote, "We shouldn't have killed John, we should have killed Bobby," end quote. The meaning was clear. In the mob's alleged view, Bobby Kennedy had been the real enemy, the one making life miserable for organized crime. But we also know that many people in the government were also running plots that went against the Kennedy administration's direct wishes, working with the mob. And another large theory is that figures deeply embedded in the United States government were responsible for Kennedy's death because he wasn't following the path that had been laid out for him, and he was not sort of getting in line with what the CIA wanted. Because as it turns out, JFK had his own plans behind the scenes that he was keeping a secret from the CIA. So while the CIA were keeping things from JFK, at the very same time, JFK was keeping things from the CIA. So let's do a little history review here because this is important and we need to understand how things went down. If you didn't know the specifics and you hadn't lived through it, you might think logically that the Cuban Missile Crisis happened before the Bay of Pigs invasion and before Project Mongoose, which was the CIA's plot to get rid of Castro. America was worried about the Soviet Union putting bases on Cuba. They realized they had to get Castro out, whether by overthrowing him or deleting him altogether, depending on what part of the government you were in. But that isn't true. Both of those things, Project Mongoose and the Bay of Pigs, happened before there were Soviet missiles in Cuba. Castro's original sin, in the eyes of Washington, was that he did basically what he had said he wanted to do. He tried to make Cuba belong to Cuba. Cuba did not belong to the United States. It never did. The United States was not entitled to Cuba's land, sugar, casinos, refineries, hotels, ports, or political loyalty. So when Castro said Cuba should belong to Cuba, initially, when he was trying to overthrow Batista, the United States was all for it. They were like, yeah, nationalism, we love it. But then they were like, oh, we didn't think you meant us too. Like, you mean Cuba belongs to Cuba and, not like we can't just do whatever we want with Cuba still? Like, 'cause we don't think it belongs to us, but we can't do whatever we want with it. And yes, it is true that Fidel Castro took Cuba out of America's hands without ever truly placing it into the hands of the Cuban people. He put it into the hands of the revolutionary state and ultimately into his own hands, eventually turning into a horrible, violent dictator. But let's be honest, that's not what the U.S. was mad about. They weren't mad about that originally. They were mad that Castro had taken control of land, property, and businesses that had previously belonged to private owners, including American companies and American business people. And I'm not saying that him doing that and taking the property from the Cuban people was right. It's not right. But it's none of America's business. You know what I mean? Like, it's not for America to be mad about. And they weren't mad on behalf of the Cuban people. They were mad on behalf of the American financial interests. And that included oil refineries, sugar mills, banks, factories, etc. By the time Fidel Castro took over Cuba, American investors owned about $900 million to $1 billion worth of assets in Cuba. And to put that in 2026 numbers, it would be about $14 billion, which is not a small amount of money. In terms of land, American landowners and corporations owned about 25% of Cuba's land before Castro's revolution. By 1958, the U.S.'s share of Cuban sugar production was around 37%. Economically, the United States had its hands all over Cuba. And suddenly, when Fidel Castro came into power, that all went up in smoke almost overnight. Now, this doesn't mean that Cuba had to become an enemy or a threat, or that Cuba and the U.S. couldn't have just coexisted with each minding their own business. The United States retaliated at that time, before Castro really started getting cozy with Russia, because they felt disrespected and put out, and let's be honest, entitled. So they tried to starve Cuba out by cutting them off economically. Eisenhower enacted a trade embargo telling American companies that they couldn't freely sell to Cuba or buy from Cuba anymore. So from Cuba, we'd been getting imports like sugar, tobacco, rum-related products, nickel, minerals, and it might have been slightly inconvenient, but America could get those things from other places. But for Cuba, it was not so easy. Their economy was deeply dependent on the U.S., not just from the money they got from selling us things, but because if their factories needed replacements, those parts came from America. If their sugar needed to be refined, they were using America-owned refineries. They were getting oil from us, vehicles, food, medicine, a lot of important things. And so you might say, like, well, why did Castro kind of kick America out of Cuba then? Because that's what he said he was going to do, but he was supposed to give it back to the Cuban people, and he didn't. So once again, I'm not saying he was right, but I am saying you didn't need to escalate it, America. So Cuba wasn't going to be able to pivot and find new places to get these things very quickly because they weren't as diversified as the U.S. They didn't have as many trade agreements. They didn't have as many friends, right, in the world. And that is a huge reason of why Cuba ended up moving so close to the Soviet Union to help replace the American economic system they'd been cut off from. And the Soviet Union was waiting there with open arms like, we'll be your friend, right? So a memo from April of 1960 by Lester Mallory, a senior State Department official. This memo said that the U.S. should use economic pressure to weaken Castro's regime by denying Cuba money and supplies, lowering wages, creating hunger and desperation, which would ultimately lead to the overthrow of Castro's government. So if America wanted anyone to believe at that time that they cared about the plight of the Cuban people, while they were intentionally worsening the lives of the Cuban people, hoping they would get so poor, so hungry, and so desperate that they would take care of Castro themselves, we need to understand the real motive was always money and access to Cuba. And when that didn't work, that's when the Bay of Pigs invasion happened under President John F. Kennedy. So the idea was to make it look like Cuban exiles were rising up against Castro, They didn't want it to look like the U.S. was directly invading Cuba, plausible deniability and all of that. The plan had been developed by the CIA. The exiles had been trained and supplied with weapons by the CIA. And when the invasion failed, the United States was like, whoa, that's crazy. Why did they do that, right? Why did these Cuban exiles do that? But Fidel Castro was not buying it because he'd already known the U.S. was trying to get rid of him. He had people in his own government intelligence actively watching what was happening, seeing these exiles being trained, getting wind of rumors that the CIA was trying to have Fidel Castro killed. Every move the United States made continued to further alienate Cuba from them and push Cuba into the arms of a waiting Soviet Union who was drooling over Cuba's close proximity to the U.S. coast and what having Cuba as an ally would mean for the Soviet Union's ability to hold an incredible amount of power and threat over its eternal enemy, the United States. And then in October of 1962, the U.S. realized that the Soviets were secretly building nuclear missile sites on Cuba. And on October 22nd, JFK went on television and told the American people what had been discovered.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Finally, I want to say a few words to the captive people of Cuba, to whom this speech is being directly carried by special radio facilities. I speak to you as a friend, as one who knows of your deep attachment to your fatherland, as one who shares your aspirations for liberty and justice for all. And I have watched, and the American people have watched, with deep sorrow, how your nationalist revolution was betrayed and how your fatherland fell under foreign domination. Now your leaders are no longer Cuban leaders, inspired by Cuban ideals. They are puppets and agents of an international conspiracy which has turned Cuba against your friends and neighbors in the Americas and turned it into the first Latin American country to become a target for nuclear war, the first Latin American country to have these weapons on its soil. These new weapons are not in your interest. They contribute nothing to your peace and well-being. They can only undermine it. But this country has no wish to cause you to suffer or to impose any system upon you. We know that your lives and land are being used as pawns by those who deny your freedom. Many times in the past, the Cuban people have risen to throw out tyrants who destroyed their liberty. And I have no doubt that most Cubans today look forward to the time when they will be truly free.
For the next several days, it was terrifying. The world came very close to a nuclear war. American ships moved towards Soviet ships. U.S. forces went into high alert. Soviet missiles were still in Cuba. Castro believed an American invasion was incoming. Kennedy and the Soviet Union's Nikita Khrushchev were both trying to look strong without accidentally ending the world. The worst day was October 27th when an American pilot was shot down over Cuba and pressure mounted for the United States to strike back. But JFK resisted immediate retaliation, and behind the scenes, both sides kept looking for a way out. Finally, Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba, and in return, Kennedy publicly promised that the United States would not invade Cuba. Secretly, the United States also agreed to remove their American missiles from Turkey, which, by the way, our missiles in Turkey posed as much as a threat to the Soviets as their missiles in Cuba did. And we put those missiles there first. And we secretly agreed to remove them because we didn't want to publicly say we had them there because we didn't want anybody to know that we were just as bad as the Soviet Union, but whatever. So Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. That ended the very tense, Cuban Missile Crisis period. That ended the immediate crisis, but it didn't make Cuba stop mattering. The missiles were the emergency. Castro was the problem that remained, because having Castro be in power while also having such an adversarial relationship with the United States would continue to be a problem because there was no telling what he would do or when he would invite the Soviet Union to come back and continue their plans, maybe this time in a more secretive and less discoverable way, just couldn't be risked, right? So JFK basically realized at that point, listen, nothing we've been doing is working. Castro hates us, so maybe we should try talking to the guy. The CIA got wind that JFK was considering this, and they were like, absolutely not. What are you talking about? We have put too much in this. We've spent years trying to destabilize, sabotage, infiltrate, and remove Castro. And at this moment, we are close. Do not soften now. The CIA did not believe that any truly cooperative agreement could ever exist with Castro. And while he was in power, Cuba would always pose a threat to the United States. And at that point, they were probably right. Honestly, because Castro, he'd done some pretty bad things like human rights issues, murdering people. So I think he was firmly like with the Soviet Union at that point, and I don't think there was ever a chance where he was gonna not be an uncomfortable reality for the United States with Cuba being so close. So the CIA is like, we've got a plan. Yes, we have lots of plans, right? We're hiding exploding shells in the ocean, hoping that Castro picks it up while he's scuba diving. We're trying to get poison pills to him. We're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But we have another plan, maybe an even better one that might actually work. We have this guy named Roland Cubella, who was a Cuban revolutionary. And Cubella had been part of the anti-Batista movement. He'd fought alongside Che Guevara. And after Castro took power, he'd held official positions in Castro's new government. So he was like with Castro. He was Castro's dude. But by 1963, Cubella was in touch with the CIA. And he was like, listen, me and some others, we've turned against Castro because we believe that Castro turned against the true roots of the revolution that we'd all envisioned together. And me and many others were not on board with this communist dictatorship thing that's been established. We don't like it. This is not what we were supposed to be doing. So Roland Cubella told the CIA, listen, I'm going to lead a military coup. I'm going to kill Castro for you, and then I'm going to take over. What I need from you is that I have assurances from the highest levels of American government that you guys will support my regime when I take over. Because Cubella knew, I can take over and kill Castro and start my own government in Cuba all I want, but if I do not have America's support, I'm going to be in the same position that Castro's in, and they're going to be sending me boxes of poison cigars and trying to get me into a poison wetsuit. So he wanted to know from the top of the government, he wanted to talk to RFK personally, that when he took over, America would be behind his regime. They'd be behind him. So this, from Roland Cubella, led the CIA to strongly believe that Castro's grip was weakening and there was a growing dissension in the Cuban military that America could exploit. So when the CIA found out that JFK was thinking about talking to Castro, it caused them to ramp up the Roland Cubella plot. And at that point, high-ranking CIA officer Desmond Fitzgerald traveled to Paris in October of 1963 to meet with Cubella, and he was not in the Justice Department or the State Department. He was with the CIA, but he pretended to be the personal spokesperson of RFK, assuring Roland Cubella that the White House fully supported his regime change and they would continue to support him. So he lied. And who knows, would the Kennedy administration and RFK have supported Cubella's regime change? There's no way of knowing, only if his interests aligned with theirs and America. I don't know, but Desmond didn't know either. So Cubella said he wanted a high-powered rifle with a telescopic lens so that he could take Castro out from afar. But Fitzgerald and the CIA were like, no, that's too messy, and it might be tied back to us. Like, it kind of looks like he's being murdered. So poison is much better because we can pretend we don't know what happened, and it can look like an accident. It can look like maybe he just got a bad batch of shellfish. We don't know. But we don't really want to mess with these guns. Let's do it with poison. So when the CIA pushed back against the peace that JFK was trying to make with Castro, JFK and his national security advisor, George McBundy, moved forward with their plans anyway, keeping it a secret from the CIA. CIA is keeping secrets from the president. President's keeping secrets from the CIA. Have you ever heard of anything more American? And it all started in the Manhattan townhouse of Lisa Howard, an ABC News journalist, which sounds weird, But hear me out. So in April of 1963, Lisa Howard had traveled to Cuba and convinced Fidel Castro to sit down for an interview with her. They met at the Havana Riviera Hotel on April 21st, and they talked from midnight until 6 a.m. Apparently, Lisa Howard and Fidel Castro hit it off because he did agree to a formal interview with her, the first he had granted to an American journalist since 1959. And the interview took place on April 24th. And it went well. And then Castro flew off to Moscow after arranging to have an enormous bouquet of flowers delivered to Howard's hotel room. And then before leaving Cuba, Lisa Howard wrote Castro a long letter that began, "My dearest Fidel." Long story short, it was apparently love at first sight with these two. They began a passionate entanglement that would last for years. Lisa Howard wrote about seeing Fidel Castro in 1964 in her diary, saying that he had kissed and caressed her expertly with restrained passion. Quote, "He talked on about wanting to have me, but would not undress or go all the way." End quote. It's just crazy. The interview went live, and during the interview, Castro said he was open to talking to JFK, and then when Lisa Howard got back to the U.S., she informed the Kennedy administration that Castro was willing to have discussions, and she was willing to facilitate the discussion. So her New York apartment became a diplomatic meeting ground where U.S. and Cuban officials started laying the groundwork for formal talks between Castro and JFK. Now, that very same month that Desmond Fitzgerald was meeting with Roland Kubela in Paris, JFK met with a French journalist, Jean Daniel, and JFK gave Daniel a message to deliver to Fidel Castro when he was going to be interviewing him the following month. And the message basically said, "Listen, me, JFK, I'm aware that the U.S. has done some stuff, okay? We were wrong when we supported the previous administration, Batista's administration. So I understand why you had a revolution. It's understandable. I get it. But listen, Castro, you have to stop being so close to the Soviet Union if you want the trade embargo lifted and if you want all of these tensions to cease. We just got to make some sort of compromise." Now, JFK told the journalist, Jean Daniel, to deliver the message and then return to America and come directly to the White House so that Daniel could give JFK Castro's response. So in November, Jean Daniel traveled to Cuba, and on November 19th, Castro met with Daniel in his Havana hotel room where he was given JFK's message. And Daniel said that Castro reacted positively to JFK's words and expressed relief that the American president seemed to be moving in the right direction. Jean Daniel was still in Cuba 3 days later on November 22nd when he was having lunch with Castro. And that is when he received the news that JFK had been shot in Dallas, Texas, that he was killed. And Jean Daniel later reported that Castro turned to him, visibly shaken, and said, "There goes your peace mission." Now, do I think that Castro or Cuba had JFK killed? No, I do not. And I'm going to tell you why. Because they knew, Castro and Cuba knew very well that JFK, for a lot of things, the president is simply a figurehead. As far as intelligence, activities, what the CIA is doing, what the NSA is doing, a lot of the times the president doesn't even know. So the president being taken out, the administration being changed, isn't really going to change what the CIA is doing. Yes, the head of the CIA might change, like you saw John McCone was put in to the head of the CIA by JFK, but the rest of the CIA, they're keeping stuff from John McCone. They're still doing what they're doing. The attempts to overthrow Castro, the attempts to have him killed would not stop with JFK being killed. They would continue. In fact, at that point in the United States government, JFK was probably the only person who was trying to figure out a different way to not, kill Castro, to work with him. So do I think that it was Cuba or Castro? No, I don't. I don't. And you won't convince me otherwise. But back to Dorothy Kilgallen, who would come to have ties with both JFK and Marilyn Monroe. Dorothy seems to have known and encountered JFK and Marilyn separately and around the same period through the same glamorous ecosystem. Marilyn Monroe was someone Dorothy wrote about and appears to have had some personal connection to because in 1954, while Dorothy was away on vacation, Marilyn guest wrote her column for her. And after Marilyn's infamous Happy Birthday, Mr. President performance in May of 1962, which we're going to talk about, Dorothy wrote in her column that Marilyn had essentially made love to the president in front of the entire country. So on August 4th, 1962, Dorothy became the first mainstream journalist to write about Marilyn Monroe's secret relationship with President John F. Kennedy. She wrote that Monroe had, quote, proven vastly alluring to a handsome gentleman who's a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio was in his heyday, end quote. Now, like I said, readers assumed she meant JFK, but there is some argument that she was referring to his brother, RFK, or Bobby, as he was known to friends and family. So within a day of Marilyn Monroe being found dead in her home, the papers were printing that it was a self-induced overdose. And on August 14th, Dorothy Kilgallen began to question the official narrative. She questioned the statement of Monroe's housekeeper, Eunice Murray. Quote, she told them Marilyn seemed disturbed after the last telephone call. When she went to her bedroom, she was really depressed, but Mrs. Murray never explained what Marilyn did or said to convey the impression that she was disturbed and depressed. And if Marilyn was very disturbed and depressed at 8 p.m., why did Mrs. Murray wait until 3 a.m. before checking on her? If she was just a housekeeper, why should she be checking on her employer at all, prowling around at 3 o'clock in the morning looking for a light under the door? What this case needs is facts, not theories, and the facts could be ascertained by asking the right questions of Mrs. Murray, Marilyn's doctors, and the coroner. Of course, that last person to talk to Marilyn on the phone would be a great help if he'd tell the truth, but I think we both know who it was, and I think we both agree he won't tell the whole truth, end quote. A few days later, Dorothy reported that the week before her death, Marilyn Monroe had flown on Frank Sinatra's private plane to his resort and casino, the Cal Neva Lodge. Okay, this is a part of the whole picture, the whole story here. The Cal Neva Lodge. Picture the north shore of Lake Tahoe, Crystal Bay, and right there, straddling the line that surveyors had drawn in the wilderness, sat the Cal Neva Lodge. And I mean straddling it literally. The California-Nevada border ran clean through the Cal Neva property. It cut across the great stone hearthed lounge, and it ran right through the swimming pool where somebody had painted a line at the bottom so you could swim from one state into another. And that wasn't just a fun little novelty, it was actually the whole business model. Nevada allowed gambling while California didn't. So the casino floor sat squarely on the Nevada side while the California side was more tailored to resort-style glamour and luxury. And this place had been a getaway since the 1920s, trading on exactly that thrill of being half legal and half hidden. There are some stories, some true, some maybe polished by retelling, of tunnels running beneath the lodge, of cabins where you could disappear, of a resort that knew how to keep a secret. Now, in fact, there are a famous network of underground tunnels. They do exist beneath the Cal Neva Lodge. They were used for smuggling during Prohibition and used for something else once booze became legal again. We'll talk about that in a moment. So by the time our story really begins, the Cal Neva Lodge had a reputation as a mountain hideaway for people who liked their privacy expensive and their questions unasked. Enter Frank Sinatra in 1960, riding the absolute crest of his celebrity and influence, the Rat Pack years, the Kennedy friendship, the chairman of the board at his most untouchable. Sinatra bought a controlling interest in the Cal Neva Lodge in 1960. So on paper, he was the principal licensee, the marquee name. He poured money and glamour into it. He designated a row of rustic cottages for his celebrity inner circle and high-profile guests. And those cottages gained a reputation because guests could stay in the cottages for as long as they wanted, and they could arrive and leave the property without ever being seen by other guests or the press, because inside the closets of these cottages were hidden trapdoors built directly into the floors. So if the paparazzi was waiting outside or the FBI was at the door, the occupants could simply open their closet door, step inside, open the trapdoor, and descend a staircase straight into the underground tunnel network, which Sinatra had remodeled as well, traveling unseen, making their way to a secret helipad built on the roof of the resort's kitchen. Sinatra had the tunnels completely remodeled because they were used so often, not just by his celebrity friends, but by the unsavory characters that Nevada had officially named public enemy number one, members of organized crime. So everyone who was anyone would be at the Cal Neva Lodge, and that would become a problem for Frank Sinatra because one of those people was a man who wasn't allowed within a mile of any casino in the state, Sam Giancana. our old friend, the boss of the Chicago Mafia, whose name was on Nevada's list of excluded persons. And this was a literal binder of photographs and names of people so undesirable that any licensed casino that so much as let them through the door risked its license. The Black Book was Nevada's way of telling the country that it had cleaned up its act, that gaming was legitimate now, you could gamble, it was legal, the mob was out. Now, Giancana was practically the cover model. I think he was actually one of the first 3 people put in this book. So for a Nevada casino to have Sam Giancana on their property, that was the single biggest sin they could commit, and they'd be punished for it. Now, it's also a pretty well-known fact that Sam Giancana wasn't just buddies with Sinatra. He was actually a silent partner in the Cal Neva Lodge, and he was always there, usually hiding in the exclusive cottages with trapdoors in the closets, specifically cabin number 1, which was Sinatra's personal cottage. Now, Marilyn Monroe was also a close and personal friend of Sinatra's. In fact, they'd had a pretty intense relationship in 1961, during which Marilyn had moved into Sinatra's Los Angeles home for a while, and it's reported that Sinatra was captivated not only by Marilyn's star power, but by her emotional vulnerability, and he treated her with a level of tenderness that he rarely showed others. His close friend and talent manager later confirmed that Frank Sinatra was deeply in love with Marilyn Monroe and seriously considered asking her to become his wife, but he ultimately decided against it, fearing that her profound emotional struggles would consume them both. And let's be honest, Frank Sinatra wasn't the picture of emotional stability himself. So their romance eventually cooled into a platonic friendship, but Sinatra remained deeply protective of Marilyn. And I think also it's been reported that he was deeply attracted to her still, and those in his inner circle claim that he never truly got over her. Now, by 1961 and 1962, Marilyn Monroe was coming apart at the seams under an accumulating weight of losses that landed in her most vulnerable places, especially the most vulnerable places in a person who had never had solid ground beneath her to begin with. Now, at the beginning of 1961, her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller ended. In February, she was admitted to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Center in New York. And she thought she was going there for like a rehab experience, like, she's going to be taken care of and just she could relax. But she found herself locked in a padded ward for disturbed patients, and she was basically trapped there until she was saved. But she always talked about it being one of the most frightening experiences of her life, in a life that had a lot of frightening experiences. And the person who rescued her from it was Joe DiMaggio, her ex-husband, who was also still deeply devoted to Marilyn, who essentially forced her release and got her transferred to a regular hospital. Now, apparently her body was failing her as well. Marilyn suffered from chronic severe pain, endometriosis that had tormented her for years, and gallbladder trouble that put her in the hospital again in mid-1961 for surgery. And layered on top of the physical pain and the mental pain was chronic insomnia so severe that reportedly Marilyn couldn't function without barbiturates, and by this period she was consuming a dangerous, escalating cocktail of sleeping pills and sedatives. So in 1961, she moved back to the West Coast and fell under the care of the psychoanalyst Dr. Ralph Greenson, and this is one of the strangest and most debated relationships of her last years. Greenson treated Marilyn in an unusually enmeshed way. She spent enormous amounts of time at his home. She was folded into his family life. She became profoundly dependent on him. And it was Greenson who also placed a housekeeper/companion in Marilyn's home. This would be Eunice Murray, a woman whose exact role and loyalties are still argued over to this day. So whatever Greenson's intentions, the effect was that in the last stretch of her life, Marilyn was surrounded by caretakers on whom she leaned completely and who had a great deal of control over her daily existence. So in early 1962, Marilyn bought a small Spanish-style house on 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood. This is the first and only home she ever owned by herself. And for a woman who had grown up shuttled through foster homes and orphanages, whose mother had been institutionalized, who'd never really had a place that was hers, buying that house in Brentwood, it was a genuine act of hope for Marilyn. It was an attempt to build a stable life, and she furnished it slowly, bringing back tiles from a trip to Mexico. It was sadly also the house where she would die a few months later. And then there was the professional catastrophe of 1962. Marilyn had started work on a comedy for 20th Century Fox called Something's Got to Give. She was ill, exhausted, chronically medicated. She was missing day after day of shooting. And in the middle of it, in May of 1962, she flew to New York against the studio's explicit wishes to appear at Madison Square Garden and breathe out the famously sultry "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to John F. Kennedy while she was poured into a sheer skin-tight gown. It was one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. But from Fox's point of view, it was an act of insubordination while she was supposedly too sick to come to work. Now, in June of 1962, Fox fired her off of the movie and sued her, publicly branding her as unreliable and finished. So to be discarded like that, humiliated by the industry that had made her the most famous woman in the world, it struck at everything that Marilyn had, her livelihood, her pride, and the deep fear and paranoia that she was being used and then thrown away, because Marilyn always felt that she was being used and thrown away. So Frank Sinatra frequently brought Marilyn to the Cal Neva Lodge during 1961 and 1962, hoping the crisp Lake Tahoe air, the company of her friends, and the privacy of Cabin 3, which was always Marilyn's cabin when she was there, he hoped that would help her relax and heal. A week before her death, the weekend of July 27th, Marilyn flew to the Cal Neva Lodge on Sinatra's private plane, accompanied by Peter Lawford and his wife, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, who also happened to be JFK and RFK's sister. So Patricia's JFK and RFK's sister. Peter Lawford is Patricia's husband. Now, Peter Lawford and his wife are important players in this, so let's take a moment to discuss who he was. Peter Lawford was born in London in 1923 into faded British aristocracy. Peter grew up privileged but rootless, tutored privately, dragged around Europe, never really schooled among other children, which left him charming and worldly, but underneath insecure and adrift. The family washed up in America, and Peter Lawford's polished English manner and matinee idol looks got him a contract at MGM in the 1940s, and he became a reliable romantic lead. Notably, one of his early pictures was It Happened in Brooklyn in 1947, which is where he first crossed paths with a skinny young singer named Frank Sinatra. Now, their friendship was basically they used each other. It would run hot and cold for the rest of their lives. At one point in the early 1950s, Sinatra cut off Peter over a false rumor that Peter was moving in on Ava Gardner, who was Sinatra's great obsession, but they orbited each other for decades, Lawford and Sinatra, and the event that transformed Lawford from a fading actor into a man of real consequence, that happened in 1954 when he married Patricia Kennedy. Pat was the sister at that time of a rising young senator named John F. Kennedy. And in one wedding, Peter Lawford became the brother-in-law of the most ambitious political family in America. This was the making of him and arguably the unmaking of him. He became the family's Hollywood connection, the glamorous conduit between the Kennedy political machine and the world of celebrity money and entertainment. And when JFK ran for president in 1960, Peter Lawford was a bridge to the star wattage the campaign wanted and honestly needed, and that bridge ran straight through Frank Sinatra. So by the late 1950s, Lawford and Sinatra had reconciled over the Ava Gardner thing, and Lawford was a full member of the Rat Pack. Sinatra adored that Peter Lawford had the Kennedy connection. He threw himself, Sinatra did, into JFK's campaign, even reworking his hit High Hopes into a Kennedy anthem. And for a moment, Lawford was the golden link, Sinatra's man inside the Kennedy family and the Kennedys' man inside Sinatra's Hollywood. Peter Lawford and his wife Patricia moved in the same glittering circles as Marilyn Monroe, and Lawford's beach house in Santa Monica became a social hub where Hollywood and the Kennedy orbit mingled. Lawford actually genuinely liked Marilyn, I guess. According to him, they were friends, but he was also by many accounts a facilitator, the man who helped arrange the settings in which Marilyn Monroe encountered John and later Robert Kennedy. And it was reportedly at and around the Peter Lawford beach house that some of those encounters happened. Now, whatever the precise truth of Marilyn's relationships with the Kennedy brothers, Peter Lawford is the connective tissue in nearly every version of the story. The host, the go-between, the trusted mutual friend who could get Marilyn into a room with the most powerful men in the country and keep it quiet. So it was with Peter and Pat that Marilyn arrived at Cal Neva on July 27th, the very same weekend another high-profile figure, Sam Giancana, was reported to be staying at the lodge because his girlfriend, Phyllis McGuire, was performing at the resort. I guess he forgave her for the affair with the comedian. Now, this was a rare outing for Marilyn at the time, who'd been turning down most invitations, even from Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had asked her to come to a house party the previous month, and she had said no, she wasn't feeling up to it. Now, officially, the trip to Cal Neva was for rest and recuperation, and the last known photos of Marilyn Monroe alive were taken there. But unofficially, that trip seems to have been the people around Marilyn having ulterior motives to get her there so they could perform an intervention of sorts, not for drugs or anything, because there are reports that Marilyn was seen around the hotel and the lodge, like not doing well, messed up, drunk, on pills, and that she even overdosed and had to be like airlifted out. They got her through the tunnels and had her flown back so she could get medical help. And I guess Frank Sinatra was like, get her out of here. It's a bad look. But anyways, not for the drugs, not an intervention of, like you should stop the drugs and the alcohol, but allegedly Peter Lawford, Sam Giancana, and Frank Sinatra wanted to get Marilyn alone so they could talk to her about the Kennedys. Now, some claims say they were trying to convince her to not go public with her relationship with JFK because she, I guess, had been talking about doing that. But some claims say they were trying to intimidate her to stop talking about the Kennedys in general. And some claims, a lot of claims, and I think this is the one that I believe, is that Peter Lawford wanted her to be there and wanted Frank Sinatra's support, and sort of Sam Giancana's just like, I guess, muscle, because Peter was breaking the news to Marilyn that it was over between not just her and JFK, but whatever relationship she had going on with RFK, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that was over too. Like all her relationships with the Kennedys were severed, basically. Like, you're not going to talk to them anymore. And you can't, you're bad. You're bad for the Kennedy family. They can't have anybody knowing about you. Things are really hot right now. J. Edgar Hoover is digging up dirt every single second he can. So we got to chill. You can't be doing this anymore. That's what I believe happened. That happened that weekend at the Cal Neva Lodge. And that's why I think that Marilyn started drinking and consuming so many substances. So we already know that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was just absolutely out of pocket, and they conducted illegal, warrantless electronic surveillance on American citizens for decades. That includes wiretaps, microphones, bugs, things they knew full well were illegal. And in fact, there's a documented internal memo trail in which the FBI discussed that they knew what they were doing was clearly illegal, but they kept doing it anyways. They just made sure to destroy the paperwork and evidence of doing it. The FBI did have its own file on Marilyn Monroe, categorized under internal security starting in 1955, and that was triggered by her marriage to Arthur Miller, who was suspected of having deep ties to the Communist Party. Everybody was a communist. Marilyn Monroe was also the target, though, of heavy surveillance and wiretapping. And although it doesn't seem technically the FBI was responsible for the initial installation of the spying equipment, there are some rumors and some supporting evidence that the FBI benefited from the surveillance. So in 1972, actress Veronica Hamill and her husband purchased Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home, and they began doing renovations. The contractors found that the house was threaded with an elaborate covert eavesdropping and phone tapping system, wiring and bugs that reached into every room. This was a highly sophisticated commercial-grade system built directly into the walls and roof, a system that a retired Justice Department official claimed was not commercially available in 1962. The components were standard FBI-issue government gear. So not saying it's from the FBI, but saying somebody got it from that source. The system also drew power directly from the home's electricity so that the batteries would never die, and the audio feeds were hardwired to transmit outside the property lines to a nearby listening post, meaning Marilyn's house was sending out live audio and phone calls 24/7. It was hot all the time. So who would want to put Marilyn Monroe under surveillance, and why? Well, honestly, It seems the figures responsible for the initial surveillance were Fred Otash and Bernard Spindel, both private investigators with extensive wiretapping experience. In 1966, the Manhattan District Attorney raided Spindel's home as part of a wiretapping case, a different one. They seized his equipment and tapes, and Spindel filed a legal demand for the return of the seized material, claiming in a court motion that some of that material taken during the raid contained, quote, tapes and evidence concerning circumstances surrounding and causes of death of Marilyn Monroe, which strongly suggests that the officially reported circumstances of her demise are erroneous, end quote. Spindel said that some of the tapes also contained an original recording of a conversation between himself, RFK, and FBI agent James Kelly, and the conversation was about Jimmy Hoffa. Now, Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most powerful and controversial labor leaders in American history who rose to the top of the Teamsters Union in 1957 and built it into the most powerful union in the country with millions of members and, of course, an enormous pension fund. The catch was that he built and held that power partly through deep ties to, of course, organized crime. Hoffa worked hand in glove with mafia figures. He used the Teamsters pension fund as a slush fund that helped finance mob ventures, including Las Vegas casinos. And Hoffa wasn't shy about intimidation and corruption, and that made him the central target of Robert Kennedy's crusade against labor racketeering. First in the Senate racketeering of the late 1950s when he was a senator, when RFK was a senator, and then when he was the Attorney General, the two became bitter personal enemies. Kennedy's Justice Department finally got Hoffa, and he was convicted of jury tampering and pension fund fraud in 1964. He went to federal prison in 1967. Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971, but Hoffa would claim for the rest of his life that RFK and the FBI had gotten his conviction using an illegal Kennedy-orchestrated surveillance campaign against him, which was probably true. But here's the thing, Bernie Spindel was Hoffa's personal and trusted wiretapper, and the federal government treated Spindel as a co-conspirator, and they famously stood trial together in 1957 for illegal wiretapping, Spindel and Hoffa. Now, that doesn't mean that the FBI maybe didn't use Spindel when it was convenient for them. I'm not saying they did, but they could have. They used the mafia, and they also went after the mafia. Or they could have used somebody else to illegally wiretap Jimmy Hoffa. I don't know, but we'll get there. So in 1966, Bernard Spindel said he'd been hired by Jimmy Hoffa in the early summer of 1962 to bug Marilyn Monroe's house. He also claimed that the recordings that he had captured the final hours of her life, and it would prove that the official narrative that she'd taken her own life through an intentional overdose was false. Now, apparently, Jimmy Hoffa wanted to know what Marilyn Monroe was saying and who she was talking to, not because he was interested in her, but he knew that RFK and the Justice Department were closing in on him, and he wanted dirt on the Kennedys to be able to blackmail RFK into backing off and leaving him alone. And also, Jimmy Hoffa was backing Nixon for president, who, like I said, would eventually commute his sentence. So he was trying to get dirt on the Kennedys in general, JFK, RFK, didn't matter, so that it would help Nixon win the presidency, because if JFK ran against him, they were worried that Nixon wouldn't win. This is when Fred Otash enters, the LAPD Vice Squad detective turned elite private investigator who acted as the local on-the-ground operator, and he would take care of the day-to-day monitoring of the audio feeds from Marilyn's house, while Bernard Spindel would be brought out from the East Coast occasionally to make sure everything was still working as it needed to, configure the wiring, whatever. Now, Otash had already bugged Peter Lawford's Malibu Beach house, which the Kennedy brothers used as a place to stay when they were on the West Coast. And he was monitoring Peter Lawford, I think for Howard Hughes at this point, the eccentric billionaire, who, funnily enough, actually, Robert Mayhew, the CIA cutout, who was Sam Giancana's CIA contact for Kill Fidel Castro Phase 1, he would end up being, I think around that same time and going forward, Howard Hughes's financial advisor or assistant. I don't think they ever met in person, but they were in constant contact. So that's just an interesting fun fact. But anyways, while he was monitoring Peter Lawford, This is when Fred Otesh discovered there was a relationship between JFK and Marilyn Monroe, because JFK and Marilyn would meet at Peter Lawford's beach house. Fred Otesh had been hired to bug Peter Lawford's house by Howard Hughes, who was also backing Nixon financially in the next race and also wanted dirt on the Kennedys. So with Marilyn's house, the surveillance there, both Fred Otesh and Bernard Spindle said that they were being paid and had been hired by Jimmy Hoffa. Additionally, according to his private files, Otesh had also been hired by Marilyn herself to install a mini listening device so that she could secretly record her own phone calls with the Kennedys. I don't know whether it was for protection or whether she was going to use it to expose them at one time. But on top of all of that, there is some suggestion that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were somehow aware of things that they could only know if they had access to that wiretap. It is believed the FBI either piggybacked off the signal that was already there, or J. Edgar Hoover, through his informants, requested a transcript every time Marilyn Monroe talked to JFK or RFK. And then those transcripts would be placed into Hoover's private files, which he kept locked in a cabinet inside his personal office. They were never included in the general FBI files because he wanted to keep them under wraps, and anybody in the FBI can access the FBI files. He wanted to keep them safe so he could ensure that the Kennedys would never be able to remove him as FBI director. And when Hoover died in 1972, his personal secretary, Helen Grady, immediately got to work shredding those private files. So I don't think she got all of them, but she got a lot. And then later, they asked her, I think she had to testify, and they were like, Helen, why'd you do that? And she said, listen, I only did what J. Edgar Hoover told me to, and I was only destroying private correspondence. She pretty much tried to say that there was nothing like in there that was official files or anything. It was just private correspondence, which I don't believe. There was definitely a secret file that J. Edgar Hoover kept on every president, on every figure who threatened him. People have testified to it. People have talked about it. He knew things. So she was definitely trying to protect him from that. I don't know why, but maybe they had a special relationship too. Once again, officially, the authorities have said no such tapes were ever found in Bernard Spindle's home. Tapes with Marilyn's last hours. They say they did not exist. These tapes do not exist. But the authorities often deny the existence of these kinds of things, which we are going to talk about. So Marilyn Monroe was the center point of all of this subterfuge simply because she seemed to be having some kind of relationship with both JFK and RFK. Now, the JFK relationship is pretty well known, well accepted, but the RFK relationship is said to not be supported by a ton of evidence, which I disagree with, okay? There is plenty of evidence that Marilyn Monroe and RFK had some kind of relationship. Now, Marilyn and RFK first met at Peter Lawford's house on February 1st, 1962, and according to Marilyn's friend, model Janine Carmen, the two clicked immediately, and RFK would soon become a guest at Marilyn's home. So after the Happy Birthday, Mr. President performance in May of 1962, multiple people reported seeing Monroe aggressively pursuing RFK in front of his wife, Ethel Kennedy, who apparently was not happy about it. And after the birthday party for JFK at Madison Square Garden, there was an after party held at the Manhattan townhouse of studio head Arthur Krim. And this is where the only known picture of Marilyn Monroe with both JFK and RFK was taken. And Lou Harris, an American pollster and a well-known member of the Kennedy Inner Circle, he said he saw Marilyn pin RFK against a wall. And actress Shirley MacLaine made a highly publicized claim that she saw JFK walk out of a bedroom that Marilyn was staying in, and the moment he stepped out, his brother RFK went in, closing the door behind him. And most pieces of physical and clear evidence, though, come from a 2-page letter written by Jean Kennedy, who was RFK and JFK's sister, a letter written to Marilyn Monroe. Now, this letter just came to light in 2023 when it was sold at auction along with some other Marilyn personal items. It was written in the 1960s, and in it, Jean said, quote, "Understand that you and Bobby are the new item. We all think you should come home with him when he comes back east." End quote. Bobby, not Jack, Bobby. But even though she was with JFK too, but Bobby, like there seemed to be some kind of relationship. Apparently, according to some, RFK had told Marilyn he was going to leave his wife for her. So let's look at the timeline. Following JFK's birthday gala in May of 1962, JFK reportedly realized that Marilyn Monroe was getting a bit too public and a bit too messy, and she was talking about him, and this was turning his entanglement with her into a massive political liability, because just a few months before this, he'd already had to have a talking to about his other mistress, Judith Campbell Exner, by both J. Edgar Hoover and RFK, and they told him, end it with Judith. And reportedly at that time, RFK also floated the idea of maybe making a clean break with Marilyn as well, but apparently JFK resisted until the birthday party, when he was like, okay, it's time. Like, this is pretty obvious, what she's singing to me. And like, it's obvious. Everyone can tell. We got to go. And this is when he told the White House switchboard to stop putting Marilyn's calls through. So it looks like JFK didn't even break up with Marilyn in person. It is likely he used his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, to deliver the message, which Marilyn did not take well. And then, when Marilyn was at the Calanaba Lodge the week before her death, it's alleged that Peter Lawford took that opportunity to deliver another message that her contact with RFK would also be terminated. But here's the thing. Apparently, according to her phone records, Marilyn continued to call the Justice Department trying to talk to RFK, which allegedly is what led RFK to travel to Los Angeles on August 4th, 1962, to pay a visit to Marilyn Monroe and tell her that she needed to stop calling and they could no longer have a close relationship. And this is where the idea that RFK was with Marilyn Monroe on the day that she died, this is where that idea is born. I don't know, there's something to it. So let's fast forward to July of 1964, when the FBI field office obtained a copy of a book about Marilyn Monroe written by a guy named Frank Capel with the help of Sergeant Jack Clemens. Sergeant Jack Clemens, the first detective on the scene of Marilyn Monroe's death. And the book was set to be published on July 10th of that year. And the FBI wanted to see what claims were being made. Okay? Because they were very interested. The FBI is always very interested in Marilyn Monroe, even after she dies. They wanted to see what claims were being made. And as it turns out, the book made some claims. So Frank Capel presented the theory that Marilyn and RFK had been having a passionate affair. She was threatening to expose it, and so she was killed. Now, Sergeant Jack Clemens, as the first person at the scene of her death, had noted some suspicious things that made him question what he had walked into. We don't have a ton of time to go too deep into this. I wish we did, and I would tell you every weird thing about Marilyn Monroe's death, but basically, Clemens was deeply disturbed by the conflicting stories from Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, and Marilyn's doctors, Dr. Ralph Greenson and Dr. Hyman Engelberg. So Murray had told Clemens that night that she'd gone to bed at 10, and then she'd woken up at midnight and grew concerned when she saw underneath the door that Marilyn's light was still on, even though Marilyn had gone to bed several hours before. And when Eunice Murray found that the door was locked, she grew concerned. She called Dr. Greenson. Soon after midnight, he arrived. Soon after he got the call, he had to break a window pane to get into Marilyn's bedroom, where he found her unconscious in her bed. Now, in a letter to Norman Rustin, Greenson claimed, quote, "I could see the phone clutched tightly in her right hand," end quote. Greenson then called Dr. Engelberg, who arrived and officially pronounced Marilyn Monroe dead at 12:50 a.m. Sergeant Clemens then asked if Marilyn had been found unconscious around midnight and pronounced dead at 12:50, why had no one called the police until 4:25 a.m.? And this was a good question. This led to the stories and timelines changing and shifting. And then Clemens also noticed that when he entered Marilyn's bedroom, he saw the phone on the nightstand with the handset on it, as if somebody had touched her body and moved it and took the phone out of her hand. He was also shown bottles of pills on the nightstand, but he was puzzled why there was no drinking glass on the nightstand. If she was taking all these pills and that's how she died, which is the official narrative, how did she take the pills? So he and the others walked around the bedroom trying to find something Marilyn could have used to take all those pills, but they never found anything. And reportedly, Jack Clemens, the first detective on the scene, he noticed that the bathroom connected to Marilyn's bedroom had the water turned off because there was renovations happening. So there was no water source inside that bedroom that Marilyn had been locked inside of since 8 p.m., which was the time that Eunice Murray told the police Then Marilyn went to bed. So Frank Cappell's book alleged that there were personal calls, witnesses, writings, and tape recordings to prove the relationship between Marilyn and RFK, Bobby. And he alleged that the delayed time between finding Marilyn and calling the police was a window for RFK, Bobby, to get away from LA so that he would be nowhere close when Marilyn's death was announced to the public and the press. So the 1964 FBI memo says that this allegation was provably false since RFK was with his family in San Francisco the weekend of August 4th, 1962. We'll talk about that. Now, a few days after this memo, on July 8th, 2 days before the book's going to be published, Frank Cappell's book, J. Edgar Hoover sent a warning to RFK about Cappell's upcoming book, and Hoover says much of the information from Cappell was questionable and not subject to cooperation. Note, J. Edgar Hoover does not say all the information is questionable and not subject to cooperation, but here's the thing. Since 1964 and even before, multiple people have come forward to state that RFK was at Marilyn's home on August 4th. Multiple people have claimed that he was in the Los Angeles area, and even people close to the investigation into Marilyn's death have made claims that sort of support the stuff that Cappell was claiming in his book, written just 2 years after Marilyn Monroe's death. So Joe Hyams was a New York Herald Tribune correspondent, and he and celebrity photographer and friend of Marilyn Monroe, William Woodfield, arrived at Marilyn's home before the property was completely locked down by police tape on the night she died. And at first, Hyams covered the tragedy as, a breaking news reporter. Marilyn Monroe, big star, she's dead, what's going on? But within a week of Marilyn's death, he and Woodfield began digging into inconsistencies surrounding the timeline and the local movements of certain individuals. And they said they tracked down a pilot's log at the Santa Monica airport and discovered that a helicopter had been chartered in the early hours of August 5th to pick up a single passenger from Peter Lawford's Malibu beach house. Now keep in mind, according to Peter Lawford, he had talked to Marilyn on the phone earlier that night at some point between 7 or 8 p.m. The timelines changed. But Lawford said that Marilyn sounded groggy and depressed, and she told him, say goodbye to Jack and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. Jack, as in JFK, her boyfriend, who apparently wasn't talking to her anymore, just ghosted completely, went cold. A total discard. So during the conversation, Peter Lawford said that Marilyn's voice faded out. And when he tried to call back, her line was busy. Peter Lawford then called his manager, Milton Evans, because he was worried about Marilyn. And Evans told him, don't go over to Marilyn's. You've been drinking. Apparently, Peter Lawford was having a party at his beach house that night. He'd invited Marilyn. She said she didn't feel up to it. So he'd been drinking because he was having a party. And his manager was like, you can't go over there. I'll handle it. So Milton Evans, at 8:30, he called and left a message for Marilyn's attorney, who's also named Milton Rudden. And Milton Rudden also happened to be Dr. Greenson's brother-in-law. So Milton Rudden called Evans back 15 minutes later, and Evans told him what Peter Lawford had claimed about the phone call and Marilyn sounding groggy and then the phone being busy. Milton Rudden then called Marilyn's house at 9 p.m. and talked to the housekeeper, Eunice Murray. Eunice told him, everything's fine. She reassured him. Marilyn was fine. She was in her bedroom. Okay, so now Joe Hyams and William Woodfield claim they found out about this helicopter at Peter Lawford's home that same night that Marilyn died. And they claimed the helicopter brought someone from Malibu to Los Angeles, RFK, so that RFK could visit with Marilyn. And then we have Ward Wood, the Malibu neighbor of Peter Lawford, who claims that he was abruptly woken up in the early morning hours of August 5th to see a helicopter landing directly on the beach behind Lawford's home. He said as the helicopter descended, it hovered so close that the intense downdrift from the rotors whipped through his own backyard, and that forcefully blew loose dirt, dead leaves, and debris straight into his pristine swimming pool, right? Peter Lawford's neighbor's pool, not Peter Lawford's pool. And then after the helicopter landed, one passenger got out before immediately taking off into the night. The neighbor said he looked outside and he said, oh, hey, there's Bobby Kennedy. He saw him walk to the house and that was all he saw. Ward Wood said he knows it was Bobby Kennedy, but he also knew Kennedy was his neighbor's brother-in-law, and seeing him there at Peter Lawford's Malibu house wasn't anything new or noteworthy. He was there all the time. Now, this would have been RFK allegedly returning from Marilyn's home before he was whisked whisked away to LAX so he could be flown to San Francisco, where he was supposed to have been all weekend. At approximately 12:10 a.m. on August 5th, Beverly Hills police officer Lynn Franklin pulled over a vehicle speeding east down Olympic Boulevard, and he said when he walked to the driver's side, he immediately recognized Peter Lawford, who he knew from the neighborhood, and because he was an actor. And then when Franklin shined his light into the back seat, he saw the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and Lawford explained that he was rushing RFK back to his hotel so he could make a last-minute late-night flight, and Franklin told him that if they were going to the hotel that Lawford claimed they were going to, they'd missed the exit 2 back already. And then I guess RFK in the back seat, according to Lynn Franklin, was like, "You idiot," talking to Peter Lawford. And then Lynn Franklin, the police officer, he was like, "Well, I'm going to let them go. This is an important national law enforcement figure who's being rushed off to do important national law enforcement stuff, so they can have a warning, whatever." And then they sped off, right, towards the airport. We aren't done yet, because back to Joe Hyams and William Woodfield, who realized when they found out about this helicopter thing that it was huge. They had a monumental front page story. So they did what good journalists do, and they went to the Attorney General's office to get a comment. They were like, "Hey, we're going to print something about you. You are going to give us a comment or you're not, but we're going to still, print it." And at that point, they said that RFK's spokesperson did not deny the helicopter thing, but they were asked to not print the story because it was an issue of national security. So Joe Hyams ignored this. He wrote the story anyways, but when he submitted it to his editors, they decided not to publish it. Hyams thinks that they were pressured by the government. And in 1964, William Woodfield tracked down Dr. Greenson. He called him and recorded their phone conversation.
"I can't explain myself or defend myself without revealing things that I don't want to reveal. I feel I can't, you can't go around and say, well, I'll tell you this and I won't tell you that. It's a terrible position. I can't talk about it because I can't tell the whole story. But, talk about it, Kenneth."
Now, this could be edited to sound a certain way, right? So people who say, "Oh, this isn't what it sounds like," they say it was edited. And apparently before Dr. Greenson said, "Talk to Bobby Kennedy," he'd been asked about Frank Capple's book, which was going to be coming out right before the election, where RFK was up for a New York senator position. But Greenson wasn't asked, "What do you think about the impact on Robert Kennedy?" He was just asked, "What do you think about the book coming out before the election?" He wasn't asked about Robert Kennedy. He was not asked about how it would impact Robert Kennedy. So for Dr. Greenson to say RFK's name in relation to this conversation about Marilyn Monroe and the alleged relationship, it is still weird. And all the talk about not being able to talk because he would reveal things he didn't want to reveal and he couldn't tell the whole story, that's not edited. You're still saying that, even if it's taken, how out of context could that be taken when you're being asked about Marilyn Monroe and her death and why you prescribed her so much medication and why your timelines were off and things like that. Deborah Gould, Peter Lawford's third ex-wife, also says that RFK visited Marilyn that day to end the relationship with both Kennedy brothers because she just wasn't, understanding that it was over. And it's believed that once Marilyn called Peter Lawford, it was around, between 7 or 8. And then she sounded groggy. And then she said, "Say goodbye" to Jack. Peter Lawford started calling people to talk about his concern for her. And then word reached RFK, probably from Peter Lawford. And the idea that Marilyn might be in a depressed state meant a few things to the Kennedys. Was she so depressed that she would start talking? Or consider doing something reckless because she felt betrayed and discarded? Was she going to do something reckless like going public, going on the record, or reckless like hurting herself, which would lead to an investigation during which her diary could be found by police and collected into evidence, or the relationship between JFK and Marilyn Monroe and or RFK and Marilyn Monroe might be found out during an investigation into her death, right? So several sources claim that Marilyn had a little diary she would write in every day, and in that diary she wrote down specifics about her relationship with JFK and RFK, and that's when RFK decided he needed to pay her a visit himself. So Peter Lawford's third ex-wife, she also said that Peter told her years later that after Marilyn's death, he'd made an early morning sweep through Marilyn's house to tidy up the place before the reporters found out about her death. And this could have been him trying to find that diary, but apparently it wasn't there. Now, Marilyn's friend, Gina Carmen, also claimed that when she'd been at Marilyn's previous residence, an apartment on Doheny Drive, RFK had come to the apartment and knocked on the door while Marilyn was in the bathtub. And she said that she'd opened the door and, quote, he had that expression of not knowing whether to run or walk or stay. Finally, I got out of the way. Marilyn came flying out of the bathroom and jumped into his arms. She kissed him openly, end quote. Marilyn's maid at that time, Lena Pepitone, also remembered Marilyn getting calls from RFK, and she said that she knew it was RFK because Marilyn told her it was, and she recognized his voice. So then, Anthony Summers was writing his book about Marilyn in the 70s, and he talked to Eunice Murray, and she told him that RFK had been to the house where Marilyn died maybe 2 or 3 times, but there was nothing secretive about the visits because the Kennedys were a very important part of Marilyn's life. Norman Jeffries, Eunice Murray's son-in-law, who did some work on Marilyn's house in 1962, also confirmed the RFK visits, but he said that Marilyn did seem to want to keep the visits secret, and she made it clear that everyone should leave if she knew RFK was coming. Now, later, in 1985, Anthony Summers expanded the work he'd done on his 1970s book about Marilyn Monroe into a BBC documentary that Eunice Murray agreed to appear in. And when Summer questioned Murray about RFK's presence at Marilyn's home on August 4th, 1962, Eunice Murray answered on tape, "Oh, sure, Bobby Kennedy was there and Bobby and Marilyn had a fight." So Murray said the situation became so sticky that Kennedy's security detail had to step in. And here's the thing. It's always been the official stance that RFK was nowhere near Los Angeles on that day, and he was staying with his family at the home of family friend and attorney John Bates in San Francisco. John Bates swears to it. He said they played a game of touch football. He even has pictures. But even Daryl Gates, former LAPD chief of police, has admitted to CBS that RFK was in the LA area that day. He said, quote, "Our records show that he was in LA and that information came to our intelligence function through the FBI," end quote. Now, Gates followed this up by saying that he doesn't believe RFK went to Marilyn Monroe's house that day or night. He said if that had happened, then, quote, "I think we would have known it," end quote. And this is interesting coming from Daryl Gates for a few reasons. I think he admits RFK was in LA that day, but his claim of denying he was at Marilyn's because they would have known is funny. I'm going to tell you why. It's absolutely ridiculous. Like, you can know things and not tell us, but you're admitting through the LAPD Intelligence Bureau, because there was like an intelligence department, that they said that RFK was in LA the day that Marilyn died. Okay, so the standard on-the-scene investigation into Marilyn Monroe's death was handled locally by detectives from the West Los Angeles Division, and they very quickly treated it as a routine, high-profile drug overdose, probably self-inflicted. But behind the scenes, the LAPD police chief, William Parker, was running another investigation under the LAPD's Intelligence Division, also known as the Gangster Squad. And this investigation was never publicly revealed, but lasted for weeks under the direction of James Hamilton, the head of the Intelligence Division. Now, at the same time, a man named Thad Brown, who was the head of detectives for LAPD, became involved as well, and members of Brown's family and senior staff remembered that he was heavily invested into what had happened to Marilyn. Peter Stenderup, who handled Brown's desk, said that Brown followed through considerably during the investigation, and if any of the guys who were working on Marilyn's case wanted to see Thad Brown, he was to make sure that they got in to see Brown, and if anything written came in, he was to make sure that Brown got it. Now, Stenderup says he remembers 3 to 8 pages a day for weeks and weeks, and these were notes that they called 15-7s, officers' memos. They were confidential, not part of the package that can be subpoenaed into court, the informal suspicions as to what might have happened. And according to Stenderup and others who worked with Thad Brown, Robert Kennedy was mentioned frequently in those reports. Okay. So we have the basic LAPD investigation and then the separate parallel Intelligence Division investigation, which according to members of the Intelligence Division at that time, when it wrapped up, they were kept like out of it. It was pretty much just William Parker and the head of the Intelligence Division who were looking into it. And then after it was wrapped up, the file was delivered directly to LAPD Police Chief William Parker. So now we should have 2 sets of files in regards to Marilyn Monroe's death. 2. Now, in 1947, Commander Kenneth McCauley with LAPD Internal Affairs requested a search for the Marilyn Monroe investigation due to a surge of public interest in the case, and he was informed by the Homicide Special Section that they did not have any such records. So investigators contacted the West Los Angeles Division, and they were informed they had no crime reports in their files pertaining to Marilyn Monroe's death, and this was due to a routine file destruction that happened every 10 years. Okay, you just destroyed the entire Marilyn Monroe case file. Marilyn Monroe, her case file just destroyed completely because of a routine file destruction. Okay, well, no, of course. I don't know if that file was destroyed. I don't know what happened to it, but of course, over the years, people made photocopies, including the head of detectives, Thad Brown, and the fact that he was getting reports from the detectives who were working on Marilyn Monroe's case because he was the head of detectives. So in 1975, some of the Marilyn Monroe files were found in the garage of someone who had once worked for Thad Brown. And after Brown's death, this person had taken the files as souvenirs because they were Marilyn Monroe, not understanding how extremely rare and valuable they were, because apparently the official Monroe police files had been destroyed, routinely, of course, and the official word from law enforcement in LA at that time was there is no such files. Nothing exists. Now, fast forward to 1982, when the LA District Attorney's Office was getting some heat because a man named Lionel Grandison had made some claims that he'd been pressured into signing Marilyn Monroe's death certificate. Now, Grandison had been a junior clerk at the LA County Coroner's Office in 1962, and in 1982, he testified before the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, claiming that his superiors, including the chief medical examiner, Dr. Theodore Curfey, had forced him to sign the death certificate, even though vital toxicology reports and police files were missing from the folder. He also said that when Marilyn's personal effects had arrived at the morgue, there was a little red diary amongst them, and he'd been told to read the red book in order to identify next of kin. And he said inside the book, there were many entries about JFK, RFK, underworld mob figures, and a plot to kill Fidel Castro, which apparently JFK had told Marilyn Monroe about while they were in bed. So Lionel Grandison claimed the diary had been locked up in the morgue safe with the other items, but a few days later it was gone. Now, I don't know how much truth there is to Lionel Grandison finding Marilyn Monroe's diary, reading it, etc. And at first I was like, that's crazy. It's Marilyn Monroe. Why would anyone have needed to read her personal diary to identify next of kin? This woman was one of the most famous people in the world, beloved. She had tons of people who loved her. But then I was going through old newspapers and I found out that Marilyn's body actually did remain at the LA morgue unclaimed, I believe for between 24 to 48 hours. It's sad. Her mother was institutionalized with severe mental illness at the time. Marilyn had obviously been married 3 times and divorced 3 times, but she had no children. And she was estranged from really her only family, her half-sister, so that left no immediate family member to sign the necessary release paperwork. And eventually, Marilyn's second husband, Joe DiMaggio, stepped in. He flew to LA and officially claimed her body and made funeral arrangements. A funeral he explicitly banned the entire Hollywood establishment from attending, specifically Frank Sinatra, Peter Lawford, the Kennedy brothers. DiMaggio fiercely blamed the entire industry and these specific people for Marilyn's emotional destruction. And actually, when she'd been at the Cal Nava Lodge the week before her death, Joe DiMaggio wasn't allowed on the property because he and Sinatra hated each other, but DiMaggio traveled to the area and he stayed somewhere on the outskirts of the property in case Marilyn needed him, which makes me sad. So up until 1982, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office had never conducted its own independent investigation into Marilyn Monroe's death. But with Lionel Grandison's claims, along with several other inconsistencies that had been raised, the District Attorney, John Van de Kamp, officially launched an inquiry to review the suspicious circumstances, and this review resulted in a 29-page report released in December of 1982, concluding that Marilyn's death being a murder would have required a massive conspiracy. It said that while the original 1962 investigation was flawed and compromised, the review found no legal basis for a criminal trial, effectively barring any future courtroom action, and that should have been it. But we have Anthony Summers, who at that time was writing his own book about Marilyn Monroe. Later, he would turn into a BBC documentary. He'd always been suspicious about the missing files and the police reports, so he covered the district attorney's inquiry in 1982, and he interviewed over 650 people on tape. And while he was interviewing some veterans from Thad Brown's Detectives Division, he found some men who had retired and who were frustrated that the LAPD's official claim was that the Monroe files were gone because they'd been destroyed due to a routine purge. A few of those retired investigators happened to have photocopies, including internal 15-7 memos and Marilyn's phone bills, which is very important. So armed with those leaked photocopies, Anthony Summers went into meetings with high-ranking members of the LAPD. He slapped the documents down and he was like, hey, this is paperwork that you claim doesn't exist. And what's going on? Where did this paperwork come from? Because you've been saying for decades it's gone, but it's not. In 1984, he also showed the documents to the new LA County DA, Ira Reiner, and this forced LAPD Police Chief Daryl Gates to hold a press conference in September of 1985. And Gates said, okay, I'll release the Marilyn Monroe report because I know it's going to finally put to rest all the rumors. It's only going to confirm what the district attorney's review from 1982 already said, which is there's nothing to see here. Gates talked about how Marilyn had told Peter Lawford in a slurred voice goodbye and how she'd said goodbye to the president, and he said the report would definitely show that her death was self-inflicted. Quote, that is the reality, and there's nothing very special about it except for the fact that she was Marilyn Monroe. It's not a very pretty story. It's very tragic, end quote. I mean, remember that Gates was the one who said, yeah, RFK was in LA on the day Marilyn died, but he wasn't at her house because we would have known it. But you've also known since 1975 that the LAPD had recovered a lot of the police files, and you and the LAPD kept denying that they existed until you were faced with documented, undeniable proof. So do you know that RFK was at Marilyn's house that day, but you have denied knowing it because you haven't been contradicted with documented, undeniable proof yet? So you keep denying that you know what you know because you haven't been forced to admit it yet? In reality, the full depth of what the LAPD had as far as the police files was never released. When the police chief Gates released the Marilyn Monroe file, it was just not, it wasn't transparency. It was highly managed damage control. They only released the general detective paperwork. Major portions were redacted. They blacked out entire blocks of text from detective interviews. They blacked out phone numbers from her telephone bills. And these were Marilyn's long distance call statements from the general telephone company, statements that did not include her local calls that night to verify who she had talked to and when. So like, did she talk to Peter Lawford? Did she talk to someone else local? Maybe someone calling from a local hotel that they've been staying at? I don't know. It was only her long distance bills and they were like blacked out. But Anthony Summers was able to get a non-redacted version of the telephone bill to show that in the days leading up to her death and in the weeks leading up to her death, Marilyn had continued calling the State Department where RFK worked. And none of that makes any sense because if it was a routine open and shut case, like the LAPD and the DA were claiming, why treat the 20-year-old police file like a matter of national security and redact all of this and only release certain things? Why did you say you destroyed it? You know, like, why did you destroy it? And then why, when you found it and you were able to recover it, were you so protective with it? If it's an open and shut case and it's like, yeah, there's nothing to see here. If there's nothing to see here, then let us see. And then shortly after the press conference, there was another uproar when Dr. Thomas Noguchi broke ranks with the official narrative and gave an interview during which he said that Marilyn Monroe's case should have been formally reopened. And this happened during a media frenzy in October of 1985, triggered by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors requesting that the grand jury review Marilyn Monroe's death. And Sam Cordova, the rogue foreman of the grand jury, called a major press conference declaring that the original 1962 investigation was a sham and demanding the appointment of an independent special prosecutor to bypass local law enforcement. And shortly after the press conference, Dr. Thomas Noguchi was at a function in San Diego, and KABC approached him and they're like, hey, you know, this is what they're saying, that it should be reopened. And he said, yeah, he felt Marilyn's case should be reopened. He said there was evidence indicating she had not taken her own life. He had been the one to perform the autopsy, which included Marilyn Monroe had died of acute barbiturate poisoning resulting from the ingestion of overdose, and he ruled her death as a probable suicide. And in 1985, he then told waiting reporters that Marilyn, quote, had bruises on her back and near the back of her hip that have never been fully explained, end quote. And then when a reporter followed up with one word, murder, Noguchi replied, quote, could be, end quote. Now, his attorney quickly came out a day or so later and was like, oh, I'm sure my client didn't mean that. He doesn't think that Marilyn Monroe was murdered, but the damage was done. And 2 years prior, in his memoir, Coroner, Noguchi stated that because certain records, including the FBI files, had never been fully disclosed, controversy would continue to swirl around Monroe's death, and, quote, no one will ever be able to say definitely what happened, end quote. In 1962, Noguchi was 35 years old and a junior deputy medical examiner, and it is a valid question to ask, one he has asked himself, one that a lot of people have asked. Why would Dr. Noguchi, a junior medical examiner, of all people, be chosen to perform the autopsy of a high-profile person like Marilyn Monroe? And then 5 years later, Dr. Noguchi became the chief medical examiner of LA County, and he would become known as the coroner to the stars due to the many high-profile autopsies he performed. The victims of the Manson family, including Sharon Tate, Natalie Wood, Janis Joplin, John Belushi, Robert Kennedy when he was killed in June of 1968. And that, Robert Kennedy's death, was actually a defining moment in forensic history because Dr. Noguchi didn't allow the Secret Service to take control of RFK's body the way they had with JFK's. So obviously the Secret Service comes in and takes JFK's body after he gets killed, and nobody stopped them. But when RFK was killed, Dr. Noguchi was like, no, I'm not having this autopsy be all janked up. I'm going to do it myself. You're not going to take him. Now, Dr. Noguchi would say that he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him in 1962 as he was performing Marilyn Monroe's autopsy because despite her toxicology report showing a lethal and massive dose of barbiturates in her blood, he found absolutely no pill residue, no discoloration, no crystals in her stomach or intestines. For a person to absorb that many pills orally, there should be yellow dye, capsule fragments, something visible. And because there was not, Noguchi and others have questioned whether the drugs may have been administered to Marilyn another way, which may have suggested a third party as opposed to a voluntary overdose. And when Noguchi wanted to run deeper toxicology tests on Marilyn's liver, kidneys, and other organ tissues to trace exactly how the drugs had entered her system, the toxicologist refused and then ordered the organ samples to be destroyed. Okay? And Dr. Noguchi was like, yeah, I felt a wave of anxiety because I wanted to do more tests, which could show how the drugs got into her body and her bloodstream. But the toxicologist was like, no, we've done enough tests. And then didn't just say no, had the organs destroyed, had the organ samples destroyed. There is so much more to all of this, so many things that don't add up about the death of Marilyn Monroe, about her involvement with the Kennedys, and why it threatened so much about RFK's possible presence in Los Angeles that day. But we do need to move on because at this point we have a lot of moving pieces, and Dorothy Kilgallen was keeping track of all of those moving pieces even back in 1962. She was already unsettled about the way the media was portraying the death of Marilyn Monroe and how quickly the officials had moved to write it off as a run-of-the-mill overdose. And then just 15 months later, another one of those moving pieces was wiped off the board when Dorothy's friend and the President of the United States, JFK, was killed in Dallas, Texas. And this shocked and saddened Dorothy. She had traveled to the White House in January of 1962 with her young son, Kerry, to meet JFK in person. She thought he was a wonderful person, a wonderful president. She admired him for all of his humanity and the rare ability he had of being able to admit when he was wrong openly and with humility. But it was when JFK's supposed killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, was shot dead by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters that Dorothy really took notice. She felt it was ridiculous that anyone should believe a well-known figure in the Dallas community, Jack Ruby, would be able to take out Lee Harvey Oswald while surrounded by armed detectives without some sort of conspiracy. And she vocalized this, saying, quote, I'd like to know how in a big smart town like Dallas, a man like Jack Ruby, operator of a striptease honky-tonk, could stroll in and out of police headquarters as if it were a health club at a time when a small army of law enforcers were keeping a tight security guard on Oswald. That is why so many people are saying there's something queer about the killing of Oswald, something strange about the way his case was handled, and a great deal missing in the official account of his crime. The American people have just lost a beloved president. It is a dark chapter in our history, but we have the right to read every word of it. It cannot be kept locked in a file in Dallas. End quote. A dark chapter in our history, but we have the right to read every word. Perfectly said. A timeless statement, some might say. Dorothy knew that the dark chapter was not going to be handed to her to read every word. She knew she would have to go searching for it, which is exactly what she did. And that is where we'll pick up in part 3. Thank you so much. I know this was a long video, but it was fun. I would like you to like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, subscribe if you haven't already, and please join me for a conversation about everything we've discussed so far in the comment section below. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Love you so much. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly, and so you got to let it go. I got blood